Good afternoon, everyone. I want to, before we start, recognize two members who have decided that they want to leave us in Congress. Mr. Brad Winstrup and Brian Higgins. Since the last time that we met, the news came out with both of them. Brad has devoted his life to service, whether it was in the Army, whether it was as a doctor, or also in Congress. And Brian has been a tireless advocate for Western New York, dating all the way back to his time on the Buffalo City Council. We all wish you both well in your next endeavors, and we will miss you, but we're still gonna have some fun time ahead. So, Richie, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also say some really fine things about the two people that you've just referenced. Brian Higgins would have shared many of the same traditions that I did coming along on the City Council on the way up, but a stellar member of this committee in all forms. And Brad Winstrup, I am delighted to have met. What a terrific human being. And we're gonna miss him. Really fine guy. And, you know, at the time that I've been here, they also have something else in common. They both knew how to make their point, but they were never malicious. Thank you.
The October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas was barbaric and horrifying. Civilians were targeted, tortured, raped, murdered, and kidnapped. Approximately 240 people are being held hostage in Gaza right now. They range in age from 9 months to 85 years old and come from over 33 countries, including the United States. The families of these hostages are living in anguish, hoping and praying their loved ones are alive and will come home. We stand with these families and Israel. We affirm Israel's right to fully defend itself against terrorists. While we stand with the Jewish people, what makes this moment worse is that many have responded by blaming Israel. Unfortunately, the hateful beliefs behind the attack are not isolated to the Middle East. This committee has jurisdiction over the tax code and must address two related issues that have been laid bare in the aftermath of October 7th. First, tax-exempt charities operating in the United States are providing support, encouragement, and potential financing to Hamas and Hamas-affiliated groups. This concern is not theoretical. In the early 2000s, the US government identified and shut down the Holy Land Foundation in the United States. That foundation funneled $12.4 million from Americans to Hamas. Shockingly, a 501c3 entity called American Muslims for Palestine and its related C4 have been sued in federal court for operating as an alter ego of the Holy Land Foundation. The two groups have many of the same leaders and may be continuing the same efforts to support Hamas. Second, the eruption of hatred towards Jewish students on college campuses after the October 7th attack has been disturbing to watch. But the organization around it is not some organic movement. It has been carefully built over years, in part by American Muslims for Palestine. They helped build, shape, and train a group called Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. Many SJP events have involved pro-Hamas slogans and have led to intimidation, harassment, and violence against Jewish students. Unfortunately, an absence of leadership on college campuses has allowed hostility toward Jewish students to escalate since October 7th. And too many university presidents have sought to placate the most radical voices on their campuses. University presidents were quick and forceful in issuing statements supporting numerous social justice matters. They haven't shied away from commenting on other events affecting their students. But when it comes to the bloodiest day for Jews since the Holocaust, they couldn't find their voices. Cornell's president had to clarify her initial vague statement to let people know she does think Hamas's attack was terrorism. Harvard's president waited days to comment, allowing student groups condemning Israel to implicitly speak for the university. At the same time, we have seen pro-Palestinian protest become means of intimidation and threats of violence. When they fail to act, universities claim it's about free speech rights, but that is laughable. These universities have a track record of failing to protect free speech rights, while instead protecting preferred speech. In fact, colleges are actively suppressing speech protected by the First Amendment. For example, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, rates universities on their commitment to free speech on campuses. The University of Pennsylvania's latest rating is, quote, very poor. This is likely due to multiple instances of professors being investigated and disciplined for expressing various opinions relating to race and gender. Universities can and should protect free speech rights on campus for all voices, not just the ones that they prefer. This shouldn't be hard. Good people around the world have the moral clarity to call out evil as evil, terrorism as terrorism. We should have that same moral clarity as we proceed today. I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Nill, for his opening statement.
Thank you for calling this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and let there be no doubt that I, along with our colleagues on the Democratic side as well, we are here today to condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, including the brutal attack that was launched by the terrorist organization Hamas on Israel on October 7th. The last month has been heartbreaking. To all those who are affected by the ongoing war, to the students who are afraid, and to all those whose hearts are broken watching the devastation unfold, please know we are with you. Over a month ago, Hamas unleashed evil, slaughtering 1,200 people and kidnapping hundreds, including Americans. This horrific event was the largest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust. Meanwhile, there's been a sharp tick in anti-Semitism. These are not isolated incidents any longer. They're taking place on campuses across the country and communities as well, and bringing back the pain and fear that Jewish people know all too well, and they should not have to endure. Our first priority must always be safety. Universities also have responsibility to cultivate safe and supportive learning environments. Anti-Semitism is not innate, it's learned. As members of Congress, we must lead by example, requiring us not only to reject, but to condemn hate outright in all forms. Racism, misogyny, xenophobia, Islamophobia, they have no place here and no place on our college campuses. We know that those who spew hatred toward one group also target others. Combating anti-Semitism on campuses not only gives Jewish students the dignity, respect, and safety they deserve, but also builds on our broader efforts to counter bigotry and hate. Hate is an epidemic, and it must be combated comprehensively. Recently, we've seen bombings on HBCU campuses, Asian students targeted in the wake of the pandemic, and rampant examples of white supremacy, all instances of hate-fueled discrimination, and we cannot be silent. The Biden administration has been dogged, launching new efforts to combat anti-Semitism on campuses back in May, and deepening that work over the last month. The administration has quickly laid out a national security supplemental funding package to not only bolster the fight against Hamas terrorism, but also to deliver much-needed humanitarian aid for innocent people. There is bipartisan support for this funding, and the time is now to act. The Department of Justice and Homeland Security are leading efforts to strengthen coordination between campus law enforcement, state and local law enforcement as well, to keep these students safe, while also providing cybersecurity experts to support universities in assessing online risks. The Department of Education has taken several steps to address prohibited forms of anti-Semitic discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This afternoon, there's an opportunity to listen, and I'm grateful to our witnesses for taking the time to share their experiences and to let us know how Congress can best support you. Your appearance today is a profound act of courage and serves as a powerful reminder that we must always put people and free speech first. Fighting anti-Semitism and all the hate must not be a dividing issue, but denouncing bigotry is an American value and one that we all must carry forward from this day into the future. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. I'm pleased to see such a large audience for our hearing today. As a reminder, the chairman is responsible under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee to maintain order and preserve decorum in the committee room. And members of the audience are reminded that they must behave in an orderly fashion. I will now introduce our witnesses. Miss Talia Dror is a student at Cornell University and Vice President of Finance for Cornellians for Israel. Adam Lehman is President and CEO of Hillel International. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Noa Tishby is a best-selling author and Israel's former special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. Jonathan Greenblatt is CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you all for joining us today. Your written statements will be made part of the hearing record, and you each have 5 minutes to deliver remarks. Mr. R., you may begin when you're ready.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the Ways and Means Committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. My name is Talia Dror. I'm a student at Cornell studying industrial and labor relations with minors in business and legal policy. But beyond that, I am the embodiment of the American dream. I'm the child of an immigrant who fled Iran after facing religious persecution, dreaming of an America where she could openly raise a Jewish family. I grew up hearing the cautionary tales of blatant anti-Semitism, how my grandfather was stabbed for being a Jew, how my mother was called a dirty Jew on a daily basis, how my family had to pretend they weren't Jewish. But I never thought the horrific anti-Semitism they faced would follow us to the country we fled to for refuge. 39 days ago, as I witnessed the mass rape, mutilation, and massacre committed by Hamas, my reality as a college student in the United States radically transformed. Students, professors, and administrators at Cornell celebrated the massacre of innocent civilians. Just 5 days after the heinous terror attacks, the Student Assembly introduced a resolution calling Hamas, quote, an armed resistance and placing full blame for the October 7th attacks on Israel. At the hearing, I spoke about the fact that the very terrorists endorsed by that resolution called for a global day of rage the next day. I explained that as a Jewish student leader, my community is terrified to walk around the school they pay to attend because they are afraid of getting threatened, assaulted, or killed. Students at rallies chant genocidal phrases like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." This is a chant that calls for the elimination of the state of Israel and all 7 million Jews inside of it. This is a chant that calls for a second Holocaust. Students scream Intifada revolution, calling for deadly terror attacks on civilians. A Cornell professor announced that he was exhilarated and energized by the Hamas attacks, by the murder of my family and friends. On October 25th, Cornell students woke up to a campus vandalized with graffiti that said Zionism equals genocide and new Intifada. That day, students walking into their classes stepped over calls for terror attacks and accusations of being genocidal for supporting the existence of the state of Israel. Cornell's administration has made firm statements on everything from Supreme Court cases to the war in Ukraine to Black Lives Matter. But in the wake of the deadliest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, administrators have excused endorsements of terrorism under the guise of free speech. In their initial statement, they compared, quote, the loss of life in the Middle East to deaths caused by natural disasters. They allowed tensions to fester on campus, professors to use captive audiences to preach terrorist sympathies, and the targeting of Jewish students on their campus. They paved the perfect path for radicalized individuals to shift calls for the murder of Jews in Israel to calls for the extermination of Jews on campus. On the morning of October 29th, the provost, in an address to concerned Jewish parents, explained that while he understands concerns for their children's physical safety, that they shouldn't be worried. Not 7 hours later, Jewish students on campus received threats that said, quote, if I see another Jew on campus, I will stab you and slit your throat. If I see another pig female Jew, I will drag you away, rape you, and throw you off a cliff. Jews are human animal and deserve pigs' death. Liberation by any means, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Quote, gonna shoot up 104 West, the kosher dining hall. Glory to Hamas, liberation by any means necessary. That night, I sat in my locked house, pondering my mortality. I knew that with my roommates and I being openly Jewish community leaders, our apartment would be one of the first targets for someone looking to actualize the threats. I thought back to the stories my mother told me growing up. How as a young child, I found so much comfort in having the privilege of being protected by a country built on the foundation of equal opportunity and individual liberty. 2 days later, I got news that the threats were made by a fellow student. This wasn't far away. It was at the same school I worked my whole life to get into. The school I invested my family's hard-earned life savings to attend. The school that promised me they would uphold a community of belonging. Universities have failed to uphold their self-proclaimed values of equity and belonging when it comes to Jewish students. The hypocrisy is glaring. In light of horrific anti-Semitism, Jewish students on campus have been courageous and resilient, but we shouldn't need to be. American Jewish students on campus deserve better. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you for your brave testimony. Mr. Lehman, you can now proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and distinguished members of the House Ways and Means Committee. I am here today on behalf of Hillel International, the largest Jewish student organization in the world with a presence on more than 700 campuses in the United States. Our top priority in this fraught moment is addressing the frightening rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses, really telling the story you just heard from Talia that is playing out across the country. Even before October 7th, discrimination directed at Jewish students had been rising at a very concerning rate. However, since October 7th, we have seen an unprecedented spike in harassment, intimidation, hate, and even violence directed at Jewish students. In the past 5 weeks, our Hillels have reported 398 anti-Semitic incidents, a figure that includes 28 physical assaults. This level of anti-Semitic activity represents more than a 700% increase, again, 700% increase from the record level a year before in the same period. In addition to the harrowing threats and issues that Talia just described at Cornell, at other campuses, Jewish students, campuses from some of your own states, have been spit on. They have been beaten with a Palestinian flagpole. They have been physically assaulted for the crime of putting up a poster remembering Israeli hostages. They have been threatened by faculty members and subjected to an overwhelming onslaught of hate speech and intimidation. While some of this hate speech is encoded within chants demonizing Israel and seeking its destruction that we have all become far too immune to, Jewish students have also faced calls to gas the Jews, kill the Jews, and that Jews are Nazis. Let me be perfectly clear. We have no desire, as you all shared, to see anyone's free speech rights curtailed or their academic freedom compromised. There should be space on campus to debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other geopolitical issues, including space for those advocating on behalf of both Israelis and Palestinians. But neither free speech nor academic freedom is a free pass for the targeted harassment, threats, discrimination, and violence being directed at Jewish and Israeli students. Hillels across the country are doing all we can to provide additional security for their community spaces, wellness and mental health support, and advocacy on behalf of our students. And Jewish student leaders like Talia are displaying courage and resilience in representing their communities and in continuing to work to promote understanding and partnership with other communities across campus. But Hillel professionals, Chabad professionals, and student leaders cannot solve this problem alone. They need and they deserve the same attention and action from their universities that we would want for any students facing this level of harassment and discrimination. Specifically, we're calling on university leaders to act firmly and swiftly in disciplining students, faculty, staff, and student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine that are clearly violating university policies and in many cases violating the law. We're calling on them to ensure that their DEI departments address issues of anti-Semitism with the same focus and force that they do for other forms of discrimination, to regulate and rein in protest activities that are frequently spawning grounds for harassment, intimidation, and even violence, to invest in the added security protections that we need in this moment, and to partner with Hillel and other Jewish student organizations in ongoing efforts to eliminate the bias and hostility we're describing. At a governmental level, we appreciate truly the moral clarity and expressions of support from both Congress and the administration for Israel in its just war against Hamas and for Jewish Americans facing growing anti-Semitism. That said, we respectfully request support in the following three areas. Number one, security. We urge you to immediately and substantially expand the nonprofit security grant program. Number two, Title VI enforcement. We urge you to appropriate supplemental funding to the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. We need them to have adequate resources to investigate and pursue Title VI claims. And finally, to support and fund implementation of the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. Thank you for your consideration and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Dr. Schanzer, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished committee members, Hamas is alive and well in America. Over the last month, this country has seen an alarming number of rallies, both in major cities and on college campuses, expressing support for the terrorist organization. Much of this activity, which I detail in my written testimony, includes unabashed anti-Semitism and even calls for genocide against Israel. And a lot of this can be traced to a handful of extremist groups, but two of them stand out in particular: American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, and Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, a campus group that receives funding and guidance and support from AMP. Mr. Chairman, I worked at the U.S. Treasury Department in the mid-2000s, and my colleagues and I disrupted several Hamas charities that were operating here in America. I'm talking about the Holy Land Foundation, Kind Hearts, and the Islamic Association for Palestine, also known as IAP. The case against these groups, which provided financial and material support to Hamas, is by now well known. More than a half dozen individuals who previously worked for those Hamas charities now run American Muslims for Palestine. In my written testimony, I delve more deeply into the network, but there are four figures that I would like to highlight here today. First is Osama Abu Ershad, who is the former editor of IAP's newspaper. He is now AMP's executive director. He regularly publishes articles promoting Hamas, including communications with Hamas leaders. In 2014, Abu Ershad was featured on the website of Hamas's self-declared military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades. Abdul Basit Hamayel, IAP's former Secretary General, is identified in IRS filings as the person who possesses the organization's books and records for AMP's fiscal sponsor, Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation. Today, he is active in AMP's Chicago chapter. Saleh Sarsour is a national AMP board member who previously raised funds for the Holy Land Foundation. Today, he is director of Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation, again, the 501c3 that is the fiscal sponsor of AMP. In the 1990s, Sarsour spent 8 months in an Israeli jail for Hamas activity. He used a bank account from his furniture store in Milwaukee to send money to a Hamas military leader. Sarsour today owns a Wisconsin furniture store that advertises and fundraises at AMP's annual conferences. Finally, AMP's current chairman and SJP founder, Hatem Bazian, also helped raise money for Kind Hearts in 2004. These and other AMP figures are promoting pro-Hamas sentiment across America today. AMP is lobbying legislators here on Capitol Hill. Those members of Congress include, and are not limited to, Representatives Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Jan Schakowsky, Betty McCollum, Summer Lee, Bill Pascrell, Andre Carson, and others. AMP has built a network of activists that are tormenting Jewish and pro-Israel students on college campuses nationwide. Students for Justice in Palestine rallies are not spontaneous expressions of student dissent. AMP's campus outreach coordinator, Tahir Herzala, provides guidance and support to SJP chapters and other extremist groups on campus. Mr. Chairman, to summarize, the personnel, mission, goals, donors, and infrastructure of AMP share a striking resemblance to the Hamas charities that were dismantled here more than a decade ago. This was not lost on the family of David Boehm, an American teenager killed by Hamas. The Boehm family sued AMP, alleging that AMP is the alter ego of the Islamic Association for Palestine. They say AMP is the same institution, fulfilling the same functions with the same goals of IAP, merely operating under a different name to avoid legal liabilities. I cannot predict the outcome of that case, but I believe AMP is a hate group with roots in Hamas fundraising organizations that were shuttered for a reason. AMP student networks who practice hate speech and incite violence should not be allowed to operate on American college campuses. AMP's lobby should not be welcomed on Capitol Hill. I must ask, are U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies working to answer the questions raised by the Boehm lawsuit? Is this network of individuals that formerly worked for Hamas-connected charities providing support for Hamas under a different name? I first brought this issue to Congress 7 years ago. It was around then that U.S. officials quietly conceded to me that certain Hamas networks were protected sources in the fight against ISIS. I sincerely hope this is no longer the case. On behalf of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Ms. Tishby, you're now recognized.
Distinguished members, American universities have become dangerous places for Jewish students. What is taking place on U.S. campuses is not legitimate pro-Palestinian activity, but an aggressive assault on Jewish students, American values, and the future of American society. Jewish students are being harassed, threatened, and attacked with violent rage, but we have exposed that this violence did not happen overnight, nor is it a grassroots movement. It has been planned, engineered, and incubated for decades by heavily funded, professionally orchestrated groups with close connections to terrorist organizations like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PFLP. One of the main perpetrators of campus Jew hate is Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. SJP was set up and is supported by groups with individuals with well-documented records of support and fundraising for terrorist organizations. Individuals like Hatem Bazian, who founded SJP and is also the founder of American Muslims for Palestine, or AMP. Terrorist sympathizers figured out decades ago that instead of sending money to jihadi organizations, they will target the hearts and minds of young and naive, sometimes well-meaning American students. They use progressive buzzwords like justice and freedom, but their true intent is destroying the world's only Jewish state by all means necessary. And after October 7th, we've seen that anything goes. Beheading babies and raping women is just fine. If it's done for the Jews, they call it resistance. For decades, these groups have lied to young Americans and convinced them that Israel is the ultimate evil, so that when Hamas terrorists carried out these barbaric acts, young, educated Americans would minimize, justify, and even celebrate it. Ladies and gentlemen, SJP is a hate group. It is grooming American college students, grooming your children to hate Israel, to hate America, and to hate Jews. And for years, universities stood by, watched this brainwashing take place, and did nothing. SJP hijacks any campus that it operates. And I use that word deliberately. After all, this organization that puts the Palestinian plane hijacker, Layla Khaled, on its t-shirts. These groups are not interested in peace. Just listen to what they chant. There is only one solution: Intifada revolution. On our campuses, those with bad intent prey on those with bad knowledge. Because we know what Intifada actually means. It means blowing up Jews on buses, or stabbing us, shooting us, running us down, or slaughtering us like on October 7th. And so today, Jewish students are barricading themselves in libraries, hiding from an angry, brainwashed mob. Universities have let Jewish students down, and they're letting America down. Now, this is what we need to do about this. First, we need to kick these groups, it's hate groups, off of campus. How can it be the college fees and taxpayer dollars are funding hate groups that cheers on the burning alive of Jewish families? Every college in this country should ban SJP and never let them back. We wouldn't fund KKK chapters in our colleges. We shouldn't fund SJP chapters in our colleges either. Yeah. And if universities fail to remove SJP off of campus, if they continue to protect and fund the ringleaders of an anti-Semitic mob, then this committee should withdraw funding for them. We would not allow the mafia to teach business on campus. We should not allow terrorist supporters to teach political activism to our children. Second, with the amount of evidence linking SJP and AMP members with support and financing of terrorist groups, including Hamas, these organizations and networks should be investigated by state police and the FBI. The terrorists that are supported, they are the ones who committed worldwide jihad, currently hold over 200 Israeli Americans and other countries' citizens hostages. The time for criminal investigation is right now, which brings me to my third and final point. How can groups that spread this ideology on campus that should be under FBI investigation enjoy a warm welcome in Congress? Last month, not even 3 weeks after Hamas were decapitating Jewish babies and raping young Jewish women and girls, AMP were on this Hill lobbying Congress with their annual Palestine Advocacy Day. How can congressmen and women take donations from such a group? Members of this House should never be funded from the same pot as murderous terrorists. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a Jewish issue. This is an American one. There is a direct line between brainwashed extremists who rip down posters of kidnapped Jewish children and those who rip down the American flag ahead of Veterans Day. I urge this committee to act now. Stop this coordinated assault on Jewish students, on American values, and on the future of the American dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Neal, for inviting me to testify today. Thank you to my friend Congressman Schneider and so many members on both sides of the aisle for your commitment to fighting anti-Semitism. On October 7th, the terrorist group Hamas committed mass atrocities in Israel, murdering more than 1,200 individuals and kidnapping, seizing over 200 babies, children, the elderly, the disabled, and more. In the wake of this massacre, the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, the ADL has tracked a surge of anti-Semitism around the world, and right here in America, in public spaces, in workplaces, and indeed on our college campuses, even in K-12 schools, and it's getting worse. In the months since October the 7th, ADL tracked 832 anti-Jewish acts in the US. That's almost 30 a day. Reports of incidences this year versus last year were 316% higher. And we know that campuses, college campuses, are a microcosm of what the trends we're seeing globally, but they've also become petri dishes where anti-Semitism is festering and flourishing. As you heard from Talia, and we should all salute her bravery and her courage with what she's had to deal with every single day since October the 7th. But we've documented hundreds of anti-Semitic incidents on campuses. We've seen residence halls plastered with hateful messages. We've seen Jewish students removed from student government because of their, quote, Zionism. And the list goes on. But October the 7th brought some campuses to their knees with a disturbing intensification of harassment, vandalism, and violence. We tracked 234 anti-Israel and pro-Hamas rallies on US campuses, not calls for a two-state solution, not calls for a one-state solution. These were calls for a final solution. And these are serious incidents which continue to mount. Just this past weekend, we saw at Ohio State 2 Jewish students assaulted by attackers, slandering them with hateful slurs that I'm not going to repeat here for the session today. At UMass Amherst last week, we saw a Jewish student assaulted at an event honoring the hostages. And I'm sure you've all seen the clips of the Cooper Union, or Tulane, or Harvard, or MIT, or UCLA, and I could go on and on and on. Many of these incidents, indeed, as Jonathan pointed out, and Noah, were instigated, directed, and celebrated by Students for Justice in Palestine. Let me be clear, there is no world in which a person or an organization should justify Hamas's war crimes and unspeakable barbarities. So here in America, right here at home, we shouldn't tolerate students being threatened or intimidated because of their identity. No parent should ever have to ask whether it's safe for their children to attend certain universities. This isn't a question of free speech. Don't let anyone tell you that. Freedom of expression is not the freedom to incite violence, period, full stop. But the Jewish community, we will not cower in fear. We will stand up and fight back. 300,000 of us gathered together yesterday on the Mall, and look at what happened. No American flags were torn down, they were raised. People sang the national anthem. There were people wearing MAGA hats and pride flags, marching together in this place, on this issue. It was inspiring. That's what America looks like, and that's what our Jewish community looks like. So, to the question of where do we go from here, Congress, you have a role to play, and you can send an unequivocal message. And I'll give you 4 ideas. Number 1, pass comprehensive legislation to implement the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. The White House deserves praise for what they've done. Now hold them accountable to make sure the job gets done. Number 2, pass an emergency supplemental aid bill to Israel that includes funding for the nonprofit security grants that so many of you have fought hard to make sure our synagogues and our schools are kept safe. Number 3, urge governmental authorities, the FBI and the IRS, to look at and conduct a thorough review of these organizations like AMP and SJP that you've heard about today. And finally, ensure the Department of Education has adequate personnel and resources to enforce Title VI. But don't wait. Push them to be proactive in conducting investigations rather than just waiting for them to be worked through. Thank you again for the bipartisan presence here today. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I want to thank you all again for your amazing testimony. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session with the members of the committee. I'll start. Ms. Dror, we've seen the news reports, we've seen social media videos, but you've lived the nightmare on Cornell's campus over these past few weeks. You even had to endure a faculty member at your university calling the murder of well over 1,000 people in Israel, quote, exhilarating. What has the university done to protect you and other Jewish students in the face of the threats made? And has the university's response been as swift and sincere as you've seen with other issues?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for your question. Directly after the death threats were made, I'd say in the span of 2 hours, one of the strongest statements I've seen was immediately released condemning anti-Semitism, condemning violence against religious minorities. It was a very strong statement. And Jewish students on campus were very grateful to the administration to receive that unconditional support. Since then, I'm also aware of heightened security in all Jewish facilities on campus. That includes the kosher dining hall, the Hillel offices, the Center for Jewish Living, the Chabad House, and we are very appreciative of that as well. We've received direct support from the university in attending Shabbat dinners. Governor Kathy Hochul attended the kosher dining hall the morning after the threats were made, and all of that support has gone sincerely appreciated by the Jewish community. My question is, why didn't we receive it right after the October 7th attacks? Why did it take a direct threat to murder, rape, and slaughter Jews on campus to get support from our administration? It should have come way earlier. It was an oversight on behalf of the university administration. We sincerely appreciate all of their help now, but it's too little, too late. That said, a lot of the other people on this panel have spoken about Students' Justice for Palestine. Cornell has a chapter as well. They have formed a coalition along with other student groups on our campus who have made demands to the university, including demands to divest from all Israel-related expenditures on campus. However, one of their demands were particularly interesting. It was to reduce all police presence on campus. 2 weeks after the Jewish community received death threats, they wanted to reduce all police presence on campus. That's what they asked from the university. So I absolutely second the statements of everyone made on this panel and appreciate it.
Thank you. Dr. Schanzer, we know the hateful attacks we're seeing on Jewish students at college campuses is not occurring in a vacuum. Can you help us take a step back and explain the financing, including the role of 501c3s and 501c4s here in the U.S. that generate resources that are used in some cases to support outright terrorist groups like Hamas from within the U.S.?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The cases that I discussed in my testimony, both spoken and written, address 3 charities that have been exploited by Hamas here in this country. It was quite an effort to track them down back in the 2000s. My concern right now is that America's focus has shifted over the last decade or so. First it was ISIS, then it was Russia, then it was China. My concern right now is that we've taken our eye off the ball. I am not aware of significant efforts within the U.S. government to track Hamas over the last 10 years. Yes, over the last month, we have seen a significant uptick, and justifiably so. My fear, though, is that we've had 10 years of just a blind spot as it relates to Hamas, perhaps other groups as well. As you know, the U.S. government has pivoted away from what used to be known as the global war on terror, as we've now shifted into what we now describe as great power competition. It's my belief, my strong belief, that we need to learn how to walk and chew gum here. We're going to continue to see terrorist attacks against the United States and our allies. Unfortunately, I think this is just a reality. We need to make sure that we have the resources within the bureaucracy to tackle these problems while addressing the threats of Russia and China and others.
Ms. Tishby, as you know, the disgusting show of support for the terrorist goals of Hamas are appearing on college campuses, including the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," being displayed on a building at the University of Pennsylvania. As someone who has been an advocate for Israel, focused on expanding other people's knowledge of your country, can you speak to how these displays of support for Hamas go beyond just some harmless college campus activism?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the question. So we can definitely see how when you support a massacre that occurred in Israel, you will encourage violence in the United States. That goes without saying, and it's a dog whistle to their supporters. We have seen the attacks on college students and beyond. There was a kid in Tulane University that was hospitalized with broken bones for supporting Israel, being in a rally, in a pro-Israel rally. There was Paul Kessler from Los Angeles was killed for holding an Israeli flag. So there is incitement for violence that is immediately preceded by violence, and we see this in the uptake in anti-Semitic attacks and rhetoric. We see this online and offline. There is no question that these two things are directly related and connected.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Neal for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As an academic, I want to thank Ms. Dror for being here today. I know how difficult this is for students to step forward, and I know the strength that has brought you here today, and we're indeed grateful for your testimony. Let me move to you, Mr. Greenblatt. How does the ADL, which is well regarded and always has been, believe that administrators, faculty, community members can more effectively respond to hateful speech, including anti-Semitic and indeed hostile speech on campus?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Neal. I think there are a few things to consider, and I would say right off the bat that the ADL has been fighting for civil rights for 110 years. We are ferocious advocates for the First Amendment. But as I noted earlier, freedom of speech is not the freedom to slander people, right? Freedom to talk about ideas is not the freedom to threaten people based on their identity. But there are steps we could see university administrators take. So number one, they should speak up forcefully and condemn anti-Semitism without any equivocation, without any qualification. So Talia kind of alluded to this. It should be simple and straightforward to say anti-Semitism is wrong, period, and not encumber it with other issues. Number two, rigorously enforce disciplinary rules. The issues that I mentioned and others rarely have students been penalized. And so it creates an environment where people feel like they can operate with impunity. But if you break the rules, there should be consequences. Look, and I'll be clear, I don't believe in cancel culture. I don't believe in canceling people for every imagined microaggression, for mislabeling someone. But I do believe in consequence culture. And if you issue death threats to a student, guess what? There'll be a knock on your door from the FBI, you will be arrested, and you should be expelled. That should not be so hard. Now, we have seen some administrators step up. Today, GW announced they were suspending the SJP chapter for violating the conduct code at GW. It happened last week at Columbia University. At Brandeis, they actually expelled them. But I don't think should be a place on any campus for organizations like SJP that threaten people based on their ethnicity or faith or nationality. Thirdly, investigate these groups and try to understand where's the funding coming from. Try to make sense of how are they getting their resources. And finally, we think all of these universities should set up task forces to come up with plans to tackle this issue. We talked, the University of Pennsylvania was just mentioned by the chairman. The response there has been lacking for months. Harvard University dragged its feet. Columbia the same, and I could go on and on. Task forces with short timelines to come up with a plan is long overdue.
And let me say as well, with the ADL has a long history of condemning violations of everybody's civil rights.
Correct.
We're indeed grateful for your testimony today and the plan that you've outlined. I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt.
Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, certainly the entire committee here. these are important issues that we address. And today's hearing brings together two very important items of bipartisan interest on this committee: anti-Semitism and the tax status of college endowments. While we may not agree on every detail, I believe there is strong bipartisan support for ensuring the federal tax benefits provided to the nonprofit education sector are utilized for their intended purposes. That doesn't sound unreasonable, but ensuring access to the education and training needed for every American to be career ready. We did some important work to that end in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and I know some of my friends on the other side of the dais have ideas to address that issue as well. One important aspect of this is ensuring educational institutions utilizing these tax benefits are both respecting true academic freedom while also ensuring all students have a safe learning environment. Not unreasonable. As we have unfortunately seen on campuses across the country, as some recent protests have quickly turned to intimidation, harassment, threats, and violence, some universities have cited the First Amendment to explain their inaction. This is interesting given that for years, universities have failed to protect the free speech rights of students unless they approve of the speech. These universities practice a policy of preferred speech, as mentioned before, not free speech. And of course, the threats of violence and intimidation we have seen on campuses of late is not protected speech. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, as mentioned earlier, is known as FIRE, F-I-R-E, has helped to explain the difference. Quote, "Violence is never protected by the First Amendment," end quote. Another quote, "Physically confining students within a given space is likewise unlawful." Another quote, "Just as violence is unprotected, so too are true threats and intimidation," end quote. The failure of some universities to distinguish between protected speech and unlawful conduct is truly disappointing. As the chairman noted, this is a leading reason so many colleges and universities have received horrible ratings from the foundation called FIRE when it comes to free speech. Question, Mr. Lehman, you said in your written testimony, I understand, quote, "I understand the needs and protections for academic freedom and free speech, but those freedoms are not a license to create an environment of harassment, bullying, and threats for Jewish students or for any students." So my question is, can you give us a tangible, perhaps, description of what a university's responsibility is to keep their students safe from activity that clearly goes beyond what some are saying is free speech?
Thank you, Congressman Smith. And I think we have to continue to go back to this very clear distinction. Free speech, academic freedom on the one side cannot, should not, and never should be allowed to enable targeted harassment, inciting violence, and other forms of intimidation that are directed at individual students. And that is exactly what is happening in the examples that you've heard. One area that we have really not talked a lot about, but I think helps to create this very pervasive environment of hostility and intimidation, is in the classroom itself. During this period of 5 weeks at Stanford, we had a professor in a class herd Jewish students into the corner of the classroom without their belongings and say, "This is what it feels like to be a Palestinian." That's what is happening in the classroom. Or other faculty who are, as they go on their diatribes against, in their words, the evil settler colonial state of Israel, then saying to their students, "By the way, if you go to that Students for Justice in Palestine rally, I will give you extra credit. And if you don't, you'll basically get a demerit." So this is a broad-based cultural issue on campuses. It's obviously broken in terms of this aspect of campus culture. And in terms of what can be done, you've heard a lot of great ideas, but fundamentally, we need administrators to actually take disciplinary action. And I'm sorry to say it, but too often our universities are acting in equivocating ways and not being firm. Just go ahead and terminate that faculty member when they cross the line. Go ahead and expel that student when they harass or, even worse, assault another student. If we get the disciplinary action, I can tell you at Hillel, we continue to actually work the other side of this equation. And thankfully, we do have many campus colleagues, administrators, who are working with us on educating their staff on anti-Semitism and beyond. But bottom line, we need action, and that's what we're looking for.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the moving testimony that each of you have presented. The activities and the incidents that you describe are totally unacceptable and alarming. People who failed to unequivocally condemn the Hamas atrocities immediately just don't have much credibility with me personally. Mr. Lehman, I appreciate these three specific recommendations you made, all of which seem to be reasonable. I know Mr. Greenblatt referred to the security grants, which have been helpful to a number of places in my community. In Austin, the only city I've ever called home, ADL has been a force for good for decades, and I know you've worked to combat the very kind of prejudice and hate that has been the focus here today, whether it was directed at Jews or any other segment of the community. A couple of years ago, sadly, in my community, we had a spate of anti-Semitic events.
Yeah.
A banner hung from a highway, some leaflets and crude flyers, and it all culminated in a young man who set fire to Temple Beth Israel in our community. It was alarming because we take pride on tolerance and diversity in our community. But one of the most moving and hopeful events after that was when a group of women, including many ADL members, Jewish women, organized a rally for kindness at the state capitol that I attended. And perhaps the most moving part of that event was a Muslim imam who stepped forward to present a check to the rabbi of Temple Beth, even though Muslims had nothing to do with the event, and offer support and recognition of the importance of all faiths working together. I thought of that incident the other night as I was watching cable television and saw Rabbi Mark Schneider and Imam Shamsi Ali discussing the tragic situation we find ourselves in today. The Imam said that for me, anti-Semitism is my fight, as he, referring to the rabbi, has taken Islamophobia for his fight. You know, we advance our common humanity that despite our differences, we have even more in common. We deserve dignity, we deserve respect, we deserve peace and reconciliation, and I think the war is shared by each and every one of us. And the rabbi responded by noting that they were going to every city of university in New York, in each borough, to spread the same message. Protest, demonstrate, do whatever you want, but don't cross the line. And it seems to me that's where we need to be moving, to try to overcome the anger and the grief, to recognize that Islamophobia is just as wrong as anti-Semitism, to recognize that it cheapens and weakens efforts to unite us against anti-Semitism when that term anti-Semitism is wielded as a political weapon. Criticism of Israel, very harsh criticism of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu is not any more anti-Semitic than the voices of thousands of Israelis who were filling the streets of Jerusalem protesting Netanyahu before October 7th. And support for Israel has always been strongest in this country when it is genuinely bipartisan. While deplorable anti-Semitic activities have been on the rise, certainly, there have also been troubling acts and hate speech against Muslim students across the country as reported in university newspapers. Particularly vulnerable have been Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab. At the University of Texas in Austin, the disruption of a Palestinian meeting. At Yale, a Death to Palestine sign. Here at American University, a death threat to a Palestinian university employee. At Stanford, a hit and run is being investigated as a hate crime against a Muslim. I think the pain and the grief and the anger of many who've seen children murdered by Hamas is not really very dissimilar from the anger that I'm hearing from those who see children killed in Gaza. Doesn't mean they're equal, it means the hurt is the same. And the inability to feel the pain of the other because the pain is so very deep for that individual. We need more rabbis and imams and people of more faith, of all faiths, that are working together to try to heal the divide. And I salute your efforts to contribute to us today, not only about anti-Semitism, but this need to heal as we move forward. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. It wasn't too long ago, in fact, it was October of 2018, in the neighborhood where my mother grew up, was a horrific killing at the Tree of Life. 11 were killed and 6 were wounded. Squirrel Hill. Now, it was hard for me to believe that my mother growing up in that neighborhood and being one of the 9 members of the McTighe family would ever be in a neighborhood where people fostered hate. But yet we keep seeing this go on and on and on and on, and while we have these nice paragraphs of what it is that we talk about and where it is that we think it needs to end, it finishes up with the final paragraph. I can't imagine what it's like for all of you to sit here today and have to defend your faith. Not in some far-off land, but right in America, where these are the very things we champion. And when we talk about ivory towers, the University of Pennsylvania, quite honestly, would be glad to tell you how great they are. They will tell you how welcoming they are and how they're the greatest educational institution there is. However, the University of Pennsylvania had a poetry festival. It hosted a rose gallery of speakers who expressed unambiguous anti-Semitism and hostility towards the Jewish people. All this was hosted on the weekend of the holiest day in Judaism, Yom Kippur. Now, if somebody tells me this is just a coincidence, and we sit here and we talk about it and we talk about it and we condone it by our inactivity towards it, in our condemnation of it. Look, I'm from an Irish background. When the Irish came here, they looked at windows to try and get a job and said, Irish need not apply. Each one of our peoples have gone through something at some time or another. But the Jewish people, it is endless. It never stops. We have people in the highest passions of education opening their doors to this type of behavior and saying, no, you must understand. We need to hear both sides of this until it is that we put our fingers in our ears and close our eyes to what happens to the Jewish people and open our hearts and minds and wallets and give access to our universities and championed by the very professors who teach our children. And these are the people who we want our kids to follow. These are the people of higher education. These are the people who stand above those who don't have the same education, and yet this is what they sponsor? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I can't imagine, Mr. Dror, what you have gone through. I can't imagine what you go through time after time after time, and people keep telling we need to do something about it. It's far past the time to do something about it and actually do something about it. Why would we continue to fund these universities with taxpayer dollars? Why? Mr. Lehman, if you can help me to understand this, because it is beyond anything I can grasp anymore, because I wasn't raised this way. What in the heck is wrong with these people? And listen, I'm never going to stand up and say, well, you know, Hamas, they have a reason to be like this. Bull. They have no reason to do what they did on October 7th. They have no reason to do what they continue to do to the Jewish people. And for us to stand back and say, well, we should probably cut funding to them, we should probably try to act in some way. I am tired of a United States that sits and watches what happens and condemns it, but doesn't do anything with its actions. Action speaks harder than words. Tell me, sir, what do you think we should be able to do? And especially, this is a tax writing policy center, right? Why do we continue to fund these people?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Kelly. And my wife grew up a mile from the Tree of Life Synagogue. She and I were married a mile from the Tree of Life Synagogue. We feel the pain of that community, and we do not want to see, as you said, that replicated, God forbid, on a college campus. And if we don't act, if we don't collectively find a way, as you said, to heal these communities, to eradicate the hate that we're allowing to fester, we will see it. So I know I only have a few seconds to respond here, but bottom line, and it's not dissimilar from what Mr. Doggett said as well, all hate is a problem, but we should not turn a blind eye to the fact that we have sanctioned and universities have sanctioned allowing this very specific form of hate against Israel, a demonization that goes beyond anything one can imagine unless you're sitting on campus listening to it day in and day out, and a hate that says when you're Jewish, it's okay to have this kind of discrimination pointed your way. We can do better. Some of us are working very hard, and you all, we gave recommendations. If you stand behind those, whether it's tax-based, Title VI, by the way, it's a huge way to drive accountability. Universities feel that pain. So these are the steps we need to take. And again, I thank you for your passion.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this committee hearing today, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I'm extremely grateful that you're here and that you're speaking out against this dreadful behavior of hate. I appreciate the heartfelt testimony you've all offered, and I want to echo, along with my colleagues, in condemning anti-Semitism in all of its forms. The attacks on Israel were pure evil, and the victims, the hostages, survivors, and their family are in all of our prayers. The Hamas terrorists are barbaric and must not be allowed to further harm human beings or to terrorize communities. And I'm certainly open to exploring how this committee can help combat anti-Semitism. And we had a little preview of that today on the floor. I was proud to vote for the amendment that I think everybody here voted for today. The testimony we've heard today is saddening and it's maddening. These activities should not be happening and they can't be tolerated. I want to thank you all. I'm sorry that you're having to experience the pain and the tragic behavior that you're seeing on campuses. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, wherever he is, whoever the chairman is at this point, that we do a joint bipartisan letter to the FBI and the IRS asking for that review that was suggested in the testimony.
I really don't need a mic, because especially talking about subjects that, thank you, I'm on board with you, thanks so much.
You missed your chance, the chairman's back now.
Yeah, I saw that. I thought that's what they were saying, you need to go over and
if we could do a joint letter, I'm sure that both sides would sign that, and I think it would be helpful. And if we could get an agreement to do that, thank you, I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Schweikert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the members and our witnesses. We're running multiple committees up and down, but care an awful lot about this. I also have a concern, and Dr. Schanzer, some of this was directed to you, and that is, have we created a scenario here where even parts of our own tax code, whether it be the ability to use certain pre-tax dollars, run them through what's supposed to be a charitable shell, and through the movement of those monies, we're actually functionally financing evil, whether it be coming back to our universities or around the world. And it's a running concern on the mechanisms within, 501c4, certain designs, the way we actually do not get as much information on those who get the value of a nonprofit. You have an expertise on terrorism finance. How much leakage from this country is actually leaking in to violence and functionally dystopian evil in the world?
Congressman Schweikert, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. I will say this, that in the 2000s, at the height of the war on terror, we were doing a very good job of making sure that the nonprofit sector was not leaking into the world of terrorism. In the last 10 or 12 years, we have seen a significant drop-off in actions taken against 501c3s here at home. And I think it has a lot to do with the bandwidth of our system. And I'm sure that those men and women who are working in law enforcement are doing a great job on a range of other challenges. But I think we have probably lost the scent on a lot of them. And I can tell you that there are a handful that we're watching right now. There's one organization that is openly gloating right now about sending money and other assistance to the Gaza Ministry of Health. The Gaza Ministry of Health is run by Hamas. I'm talking here about an organization known as Pious Projects. It's based out of Illinois. No one knows, no one's watching. This is, I think, a major issue. And by the way, it could be supporting Al-Qaeda, it could be supporting ISIS. We don't know. And I think we need to get back in the business of tracking these 501c3s.
Doctor, so in our hierarchy of hell, how much of it is a leakage of NGOs? How much of it is a leakage of those using what we actually reach out and thought we were creating it within the tax code, the incentive to use pre-tax money to do charitable good? And how much of it is actually, do you believe from your expertise, leakage of where even the US taxpayers are directly attempting to try to provide humanitarian assistance? Help me understand.
Look, these are all good questions, and I think right now they're hypotheticals because we don't have the people working on it the way that we used to. And this is the great frustration, right? We used to have the Treasury Department, where I used to work, used to track nonprofits here in the United States and abroad. Now they don't do anything here at home. They only deal with terror finance abroad. This leaves it into the hands of the Department of Justice and the FBI, who have their hands full right now on a range of other things that are keeping America, let's just say, very busy, right? So we've got, I think, a huge challenge here. I think there should be, number one, investigations into nonprofits that could be supporting terrorism, and we've talked about a few of them today. But I think there also should be, I would welcome this, there should be regulations that if you've worked for a charity that has given money to a terrorist organization in the past, that should be flagged. Americans need to know who they're giving their nonprofit dollars to, and if they don't, they run the risk of possibly supporting something that they don't want to support.
Can I make a recommendation? Donor-advised funds are Schwab, Vanguard. These are the largest charitable organizations in the United States. Their leadership should be brought in to ensure that they are not funneling funds to these terror-supporting organizations.
You'll be happy to know, the chairman and a couple of our members here who actually sit on intelligence, we've had side conversations on charitable giving, pre-tax monies, those things, and how we make sure it's doing good in the world and not ultimately financing evil. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity for our friends today to express their deep concern and to focus perhaps on some steps that we can take. I am absolutely convinced that this horrific set of circumstances that we have been thrust into in Israel, dealing with Gaza, we're at a pivot point. I've been in Congress 27 years. Been in Congress 27 years, have reluctantly decided to leave you folks to solve things in the future. But this is something that just haunts me. My first visit to Israel, I had a chance to go to Ramallah at a police station, and there were two people in command. One was Israeli, one was Palestinian. And there was this sense of hope and optimism. Hamas decided that they were going to turn away from that and have been working ever since, actively undermining it. And I've heard all the arguments. I understand the legitimate concerns of Palestinians. I've watched settlers scream at us on the West Bank. But the time, I think, at this point, is for us to focus on things that can bring us together, on simple steps. There's no excuse for tolerating violence. Freedom of speech is not a get-out-of-jail-free card to be able to abuse others. And everybody, I think, has a role to play in moving this forward. I'm still shaken from a conversation I had, a Zoom meeting with constituents of mine who've had relatives taken hostage. And just listening to that circumstance, that pain, that uncertainty is just overwhelming. And I know that there are strong feelings, we all understand that, but coming forward with some specifics to be able to elevate concerns and think about things that we can do going forward. I appreciate Mr. Thompson's suggestion about we have an expression, a combined expression that's positive. I hope that we don't have to continue to make clear that anti-Semitism has no role on campus or in American society. But I hope that we are committed to being able to find some things that actually bring us together. And you've made some suggestions today that are part of that. This is, for me, exceedingly painful, because I remember on my first visit to Israel that sense of hope and optimism. And we know ultimately we need to have a two-state solution. And I've heard too many young Israelis and Palestinians tell me they think it's still a good idea, but they've given up hope. And I don't think we can afford to give up hope. And you've helped us today, I think, frame part of these issues. You haven't given up hope, and I appreciate your joining us.
Mr. LaHood is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for your passion and your courage and your commitment and dedication to this issue. Very important to have your voices here today. Obviously, the barbaric terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel last month have been devastating to witness, and it's imperative that the United States continue to make clear that we stand with Israel, our #1 ally in the Middle East and the only democracy, and also the Jewish people. As the title of this hearing suggests, part of that effort needs to be looking under the hood here in the United States and ensuring that U.S. entities, especially those that benefit from U.S. taxpayer dollars and tax-exempt status, are not contributing to these unconscionable acts. Since the start of these attacks, it's infuriating and unbelievable and really sad to see the rise in anti-Semitism and targeted hateful speech occurring across the United States, with some of the worst instances occurring in our colleges and our universities. While we have finally started to see more university leaders state outright that these efforts will not be tolerated on their campuses, much of the damage has already been done. Moreover, the delay in many colleges and universities speaking out against these organized student groups has only fueled the spread of lies, harmful rhetoric, and coordinated activities that have incited violence and ostracized countless Jewish students, faculty, alumni, and community members. This shouldn't happen in America. Ms. Tishby, I have a question for you. As we look at the language and the distortion and the tropes and the misconceptions that have been used on many of our campuses, can you talk about some of the examples of these being used against Israel?
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for this question. There are so many, I don't even know where to start. So the tactic that they use is, first of all, branding Israel an apartheid state and delegitimize Israel's standing in the world. So they're trying to convince young and naive college students that Israel is it a real state or is it a colonialist settler endeavor that needs to be dismantled? They would use words like, ethnic cleansing and genocide. They're actually convincing college kids. There are people right now that are watching me, maybe at home, that actually are convinced that Israel is committing an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian. This is representative. This is a blood libel. This is absolutely not true. And the worst lie of all that they are using, And they're doing it in a very sophisticated, kind of like progressive language, right? The worst lie is denying the indigenuity of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. They're actually saying that Israel does not have a claim. The Jews have no claim to the land. This is you don't need to believe in the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament, or the Quran. You need to just know history and believe in archaeology and science. So this is the tactics that they use. They're convincing, they have confiscated the word Zionism. They have turned the word Zionism into a bad word, into a slur, as if you say the word Zionism and people are like, oh my God, I'm triggered. Why are you triggered by the Jewish people's right to have a state? You shouldn't be triggered by that. That should be the most common. This is a human rights issue, nothing more, nothing less. And this is the tactic that they use. And I will give a pass to a lot of these followers of SJP, a lot of these students on college campus. They don't understand that they're being played. Because SJP doesn't come to them and says flat out, would you like to join an organization that is about to dismantle a democracy? They don't say that. They say, freedom and justice, and they use all these words, and they basically trick students to follow them. And the worst part is the indigenuity of the Jewish people. This needs to stop. We need to expose them.
Well, thank you for that. And it leads to my next point, I guess. It seems like many of these student groups and these organizations are masking behind social justice terminology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, they do. So they will kind of, again, mask their language. I call it cloaking the dagger. So when they talk about occupation, right, a lot of people tend to think, especially people that understand this term, they think occupation 67. They would think the West Bank and 2 states, and it's kind of like murky, right? They're not hiding what they're talking about right now. They're chanting, we don't want 2 states, we want 48. So they're talking about the entirety of the state of Israel, right? They use, obviously, Palestinian, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Talks about the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, ethnically cleansing the Jews from their ancestral land. I don't understand how Representative Rashida Tlaib says that this is a call for freedom. I don't understand how you can understand that line, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, in any other way other than cleaning the Jews out of this land. So everything that they say is calling, when they say resistance by all means possible, even after October 7th. So that means resistance by beheading babies and raping women and girls, because that's what they say. And we need to expose this. And I would really hope that college-age kids would listen to this and pause for a second before they join in these organizations that are not progressive organizations, they're not human rights organizations, they're hate groups that are intended on dismantling the single consistent democracy in the entire Middle East and the greatest ally of the United States in the region. We have to stop them.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Winstrip is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here today. The actions taken on October 7th seemingly were unimaginable, yet something, unfortunately, I contend, predictable, sadly. This was not for defense of someone's families. It was not for love of a culture or heritage, but for a hate of one singular ethnic group. Complete hatred. It was mentioned today, the final solution. They're not talking about a solution, a 2-state solution. It's their final solution. Maybe this is by the grace of God, but we're cleaning the house and a picture frame opened up in the back, an old newspaper came out. And I'm going to submit this article for the record from April
Without objection.
1994. It's an AP piece in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Troops leave, stones lobbed. These are troops leaving Gaza in 1994. So even though the moving was a visible sign of Israel's intent to leave, Palestinian youths with slingshots lobbed stones that bounce off the walls and the olive drab jeeps. Youths screaming, "We don't want peace." There will be stones every day, shouted the youths, many aligned with the Islamic fundamentalist Hamas group that opposes the Israel-PLO peacemaking process. There it is. It's 30 years later. Now they're middle-aged. They're fighting age. This is the very root of this. And I'm glad we're talking about things that the United States can do and that we can do in the region and everything else. But this is the root cause. But now I'm concerned that very hatred that is taught, obviously, from the day they are born is happening here and happening in our universities. It's an upbringing of hatred. We talk about the FBI and the IRS, and those are some things we can certainly do. We talk about national strategy. Should we have a national strategy? We should. I contend we should make sure we sanction and cut off any type of funding from anywhere in the world, including within our own country, that in some way, shape, or form ends up in the hands of Hamas.
Hear, hear.
We can do that. We, the United States, can do that, and we need to do that. I'm concerned about our universities. This is terrible. Every one of us has universities near us, and we send our kids to universities. This is not the type of thing I was taught growing up, that's for sure. So I have seen in Florida, and I would like to associate myself with the questions of Mr. LaHood and to you, Ms. Tishby, when Florida is shutting down chapters of SJP. What kind of an effect is that having? Will that have, do we think, as far as maybe changing the tenor and the mindset?
Well, that was a blessed moment. You know, we all appreciated that a lot because we've been doing this work for a very long time, and we really appreciate, all of us on this bench really appreciate that you are all here and are listening. There are hundreds of examples of how SJP harasses students on college campus. And GW, they screened on the wall, "Glory to our martyrs," right after the massacre, right? And I want to make sure, by the way, that we know that this is not a little terrorist attack. This is not 5, 4, 6, 19 terrorists. This was a battalion of 3,000 militant terrorists, psychopaths that have attacked Israel. Glory to our martyrs, to the same people who opened up a woman's belly when she's pregnant and pulled out her fetus. In the University of North Carolina, they chanted, "We are all Hamas." This is what SJP does on campus. Just like terror, they terrorize Jewish kids on campus. They terrorize Jewish kids on campus. They make them afraid. The reason Talia is so brave is because she knows that to be a person who is a Zionist, who's Jewish, who's an American, a Christian, or a Muslim, anybody who supports Israel on campus, you will get terrorized. This is what they do, and we need to stop this. And I want to commend you again for being here because we know what it's like to be a kid on campus. This is being with the not cool crowd. This is being pushed out of the quote-unquote cool spaces. So we need to give her applaud and actually make it great again to support Israel and to support and be a proud Zionist. And again, all of you here, we're really grateful for what you're doing. And with the help of the good Lord, we will, and you, kick SJP off of every campus in America and around the world.
And we support freedom of religion. Period. It's in our Constitution.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Talia, I will tell you, this government sends a lot of money to universities. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of the panelists. The barbaric acts and attacks by Hamas are heartbreaking, stomach-turning, sheer evil. We could have had a bipartisan House response that it was outrageous. When we left out humanitarian help and conditioned Israel aid on tax relief for the ultra-wealthy, could have. We must also guard against terror and hate at home, and we've heard about that today. At my request, the President sought $200 million more for the nonprofit security grant program. It's been successful. We started it many years ago in the Homeland Security Committee. Jonathan, you know about that. These dollars are needed to protect synagogues, mosques, churches, community centers across America facing renewed threats. The tax-exempt organization like Hillel at Rutgers and Princeton and so many others across the country could be eligible. We didn't even include a single cent for this program in the bipartisan package, not 1 cent. According to the ADL, and I'm sorry if you become my Bible, but you have. You've been fair to everybody. Not many organizations are fair to everybody. Isn't it peace that we seek? Or is it settling? We've been in nearly 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents across the country. This Hamas massacred so many people. We're seeing a more than 200% increase in Islamophobic incidents. This is the largest rise since Donald Trump's shameful Muslim ban. That solved a lot. Colleges have reported a startling surge of threats and violence, particularly against Jewish, but some Muslim students. We live in America. No one should face hatred. No one should face vitriol because of their heritage. I've sounded the alarm on domestic extremism for 15 years, got mostly the deaf ear from both Republicans and Democrats. It's historically in the books. I fight every year for more funding to protect nonprofits. Today's hearing only reinforces the need for emergency funding for nonprofit security grants. This is all empty talk. Actions matter, as was said. Put a full bipartisan security supplemental on the floor. I'm willing to vote for it. Finally, I see one of the witnesses here, Mr. Schanzer. You mentioned me by name. I hope I have the courtesy of responding. In your testimony, you impugned the integrity and loyalty of my constituents. What he implies is total rubbish. My constituents have the right to petition their government just like you, just like me. So, Mr. Greenblatt, I appreciate the ADL's consistent support of the program I'm talking about. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the ADL and a coalition of national Jewish organizations, including Hillel. The letter calls on the Biden administration to include emergency nonprofit security grant funding in its security supplemental package. To the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Greenblatt, can you please expand on the importance of these grants and why do we need additional funding quickly for these essential grants?
So the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and Congressman Pascrell, you deserve credit for your leadership on this for so long. It protects synagogues and Jewish schools. It protects churches. It protects HBCUs. It allows these institutions to fortify themselves from the threats that are real. And I think about the shooting that took place at the Dollar General in Jacksonville earlier this year. The shooter went to a local HBCU and was deterred because of the campus security funded by this grant program. And I think about the earlier comments about Pittsburgh. We just honored the 5-year anniversary of that deadliest day in America. And again, had they had the nonprofit security grant program in place and they had the adequate funding there, many lives might have been saved. We saw shootings in the past year in California at Asian American churches. Again, had they had access to the funding, lives could have been saved. This is not a red or blue issue. This is not a Jewish or Christian or Muslim issue. This is everyone's issue and everyone's opportunity. So we would strongly advise or second the idea of more money to fund the nonprofit security grant program.
Mr. Speaker, can I just conclude on a point quick?
Conclude quickly, please.
We're here, as I see it, and correct my perception, but we're here, as I see it, to find a way to bring people together. I mean, that's the purpose of the Congress. Try to avoid conflict, but certainly stand up and be against violence. And I would hope that what would come out of this committee, any committee, is not only good intentions, but also that we understand that there's a history here. You cannot pass legislation to undo history. And we have to understand in context the very problems that we are talking about. And I've been interpreted by some as saying, well, then you're someone who simply wants to look the other way. I don't want to look the other way. But I want to be fair about it. Because the rest has failed in what we tried to do in order to help the peace. We need to rethink it together. Together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. Thank you to each of the witnesses. A lot has been said here today that I agree with. I do just want to mention, number one, there's no equivalency between what Hamas did, the horrific attacks, and Israel defending itself. And I think it's important that's said. And I think the article that Mr. Wentworth found highlights that years ago, the Palestinians could have chosen peace and prosperity and coexisting with Israel and have chosen instead violence and destruction for many, many years. And so we stand with Israel and Israel's right to defend itself. And we had a hearing on this yesterday in another committee, and it's just, it's still unbelievable to me that we're seeing what we're seeing on our college campuses. There was a student from Princeton who said essentially the Jewish students have retreated to the Jewish centers because they don't feel that they can participate in campus life, and it's sad to see. We've seen Jewish students violently attacked with microphones, forced to lock themselves in a library in their dorms because they fear for their own safety, and it's just hard for me to believe that that's happening today. In my own district, Millersville University students were targeted when a man drew 2 swastikas on campus. And one of the things I want to focus on today, though, and just get your thoughts, and maybe one of the themes of this hearing is the money that's flowing into universities. And then where universities are spending their money and whether this has some impact on the positions that they're taking. And I'd like some of you to speak to that. We know that foreign countries are investing heavily in our universities, and they could potentially be abusing our U.S. tax system while they're doing that. And in some cases, this is certainly countries that do not share our democratic values. And so, Mr. Schanzer, just want to ask about college endowments, reporting requirements for foreign investments. What steps should we be concerned? And if so, what steps should Congress take to ensure that these colleges and universities are fully disclosing where funds are coming from and then are not investing tuition and donor dollars into countries which actively oppose the U.S.?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to direct my comments here specifically to the country of Qatar. And there's a reason for that, because the Qataris are a state sponsor of Hamas. They are right now being looked at as an intermediary that may be able to help return those 240 hostages that are being held in Gaza right now. But we know that the country of Qatar has been giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas over the years, and they have an office. And in that office, we've actually seen the video of some of those Hamas operatives cheering as they saw the news break on 10/7, and the Qataris have not kicked them out. I'm going to cite a couple of numbers here, and they're staggering. Qatari expenditures on American universities between 2002 and 2023 exceeds $4.7 billion. This is a country, I should just remind you, of 300,000 people, okay? They have been spending an average of $250 million per year. It's been actually $3 billion between 2013 and 2019. There was a moment actually in Texas where Texas A&M, which has been receiving funds from the Qataris, they did not want to disclose. There was a lawsuit that ultimately had to be filed, and eventually that money was revealed.
I only have I'd love to hear more, but I only have another minute. And by the way, Cornell is one that has received up to $1.5 billion.
Almost $2 billion.
In funding from Arab countries, specifically Qatar and Saudi Arabia and others.
Correct.
Do you think these colleges are endangering student safety and academic integrity by accepting these funds? And do we know what these countries are receiving in return?
We don't know what the countries are receiving in return, and that's a huge problem. And we need to see the contracts. We need to see what the universities agreed to in order to receive those funds. And it's not happening. The Department of Education is actually woefully behind in tracking these disclosures. That is something that I would hope that this committee would look into.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Estes is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for showing up for this this critical hearing and talking to this issue that's so vital to the world, and we're seeing the impact as we look at all the news the last 6 weeks. Your testimony's certainly been impactful and heart-wrenching. It's sad that we have to convene on a topic of anti-Semitism following the atrocities that occurred in Israel. I'm disgusted even after hearing reports and seeing footage of Hamas slaughtering families and babies and abducting hundreds of other civilians. There are some here in the United States that call the barbaric invasion and massacre exhilarating. Yet that was the word used by the university professor within our borders. These are heinous acts that we should all denounce, and rooting out anti-Semitism and standing with our ally Israel is not a partisan issue. As mentioned earlier yesterday, hundreds of thousands of Americans rallied here in our nation's capital, and leaders of both political parties spoke in solidarity with our Jewish friends and allies. Yet on our college campuses, what should be the bastion of knowledge, students and faculty have abandoned the history of the state of Israel and the facts of the ongoing war, and have instead sided with a terrorist organization that is intent on wiping out the Jewish people and rallying around the cries of death to America. And U.S. officials have confirmed that Hamas is using hospitals as command centers and armories. So why are the most rabid anti-Semites and the most vocal Hamas backers on our U.S. college campuses and often in positions of prominence? Universities have seemed to have become a safe harbor for anti-Semitic and anti-American rhetoric, and it's actually frightening to uncover the financial ties between higher education funding and anti-Semitism. You know, a recent report, as mentioned earlier, about from the National Contagion Research Institute highlights about the $13 million in unreported foreign contributions to approximately 200 U.S. colleges and universities. A common thread between these institutions of higher education was greater exposure to anti-Semitic rhetoric. Not only that, but even student groups such as Students for Justice in Palestine are linked to unsavory organizations that once had ties to terrorism and potential financial links to Hamas. On top of that, the leadership at many of these colleges have been slow to respond, giving the impression that they condone the anti-Semitic and antagonistic methods of the student population. Today, I'm grateful to have you folks here that are standing up to anti-Semitism and boldly supporting the state of Israel. Mr. Schanzer, you studied Middle Eastern history extensively. What's your take when you hear college students say that the Palestinians are only trying to defend against colonialization and that the Jewish people are on stolen land? Where's our education system gone wrong in that process?
Mr. Congressman, thank you so much for that question. I'll just say that I believe that Middle Eastern studies in America has failed over the last 20, 30, maybe 40 years It has been utterly corrupted. We see tenured professors teaching opinion and not fact. When you go back and you look at the history of this conflict, there was a partition plan that was proposed before the state of Israel was established. There was going to be a Palestinian state and an Israeli state living side by side. The Palestinians rejected it, as did the surrounding Arab states. Israel ended up winning a great deal of that territory in a hard-fought war from 1948 to 1949. Israel still held out hope that it might be able to make peace with its neighbors. And then there was war in 1956, another war in 1967. Every time the Israelis offered up a peace agreement, it was met with rejection. There was the famous 3 no's from Khartoum, from the Arab League, where they said no recognition, no negotiation, and no peace. This has been the history, the tragic history of the Middle East, where we could have seen peace agreements forged. It has not happened, and yet what we see from professors on our campuses is the vilification of Israel, which has been the one party that has been willing to make peace over these years.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good short rendition of what really has happened, and we need to be aware of that. Mr. Greenblatt, how has the indoctrination of hatred towards Jews by Hamas and Palestinian authorities been utilized to ramp up such hatred, particularly in the Middle East, but I mean, to some degree throughout the United States as well?
Throughout the United States, Mr. Congressman, I'm glad you asked. I mean, what we've seen, and I would attribute much of this to the normalization of anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the ideology that says Jews don't have the same rights that we would afford to Palestinians or other people. Zionism, as Noah was saying, has been demonized. It's just the idea that Jews have the right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. That's it. It doesn't exclude Palestinians. There's no ethnocentric dimension to it, just the right to self-determination. But the normalization of anti-Zionism is this ugly trend, and it's really come through these universities. And let me be crystal clear for the record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, period, full stop. And you know who knows this well? Talia knows this well. The students know this well, because they see what's happening in these Middle Eastern studies departments that Dr. Schanzer talked about, and what's happening out of the classroom on the quad. I mean, these incidences are really almost indescribable, and we wouldn't tolerate it if it happened against any other group of students, nor should we. Imagine if in a world where we were upset about Beijing's policies, we saw students vandalizing Chinese restaurants. Or imagine if they were demonstrating outside the Asia Studies Center. We would say that is indescribably bad and unacceptable, just as this is. And it needs to stop now.
Well, thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too thank you for calling this hearing. And to all of the witnesses, I appreciate very much the profound comments and statements that you have made. You know, as I was thinking, we're moving towards Thanksgiving, and I thought of my grandmother who taught us to never look down at anybody else unless we were trying to figure out how to help them up. And she also taught us to try and have consideration for others that we would seek for ourselves. And then I thought of my father, who was her son, and he taught us to try and live by the golden rule. That is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And finally, arriving at the idea that we all learn what we live, and then we have a tendency to live what we learn. Our colleges and universities have been leaders towards more open, more expansive, more tolerant societies. That's kind of the way we've been taught to think of academia and to think of academic institutions. And it's most unfortunate that they seemingly, in many instances, according to studies and reports and documentation, to be going in other directions. Mr. Greenblatt, my question is going to arrive at you for two reasons. One, all of my adult life, beginning as a teenager, I have been very engaged, involved, and close to organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, organizations like the ADL. I've had the good fortune to know outstanding Jewish leaders like Rabbi Marks and James Ramsey, and spend considerable time with them in Chicago. If it happens, much of it happens in Chicago. Just happens to be the Midwest where it's located. But I've also spent considerable time with Palestinian leaders and Palestinian groups, and have been to mosques and have been to temples and have had those experiences. My question is, how do we move beyond where things seem to be coming? And what are some of those concrete things that perhaps can be taught that help us move in the direction of getting where we need to go?
Well, Mr. Congressman, I appreciate the question. First of all, I think, like you, my organization has been involved in the fight for civil rights since before any of us were alive. And I'm proud that my predecessors marched in Selma, stood with Dr. King long before it was fashionable to do so. And the fight today for peace is going to require us to take risks as well. And let's be clear, the death of any Palestinian child or woman or innocent in Gaza is a tragedy. And we should mourn those losses. We also should have the moral clarity to understand why are they happening. The scenes coming out of Gaza City today of Hamas operatives embedded in hospitals, using the sick and the infirm to defend themselves, are despicable. They are intolerable, and they are morally unacceptable. So we should free Gaza from Hamas. That being said, how do we move forward here today? We need the Jewish and Muslim communities in this country, by the way, not just Muslims and Jews, all people, to realize that we need dignity and equality for Palestinians, but it will only happen when Israelis also have safety and security. That the two paths cannot be divergent, they must be convergent, with both sides recognizing each other's inalienable rights. And I'll be honest with you, there has been a long movement in the United States, a peace movement in the Jewish community seeking a two-state solution, seeking to work together with their Palestinian neighbors. I think of Vivian Silver, this Canadian-Israeli woman. She was a peace activist. Her role, Congressman, was taking sick Palestinians, those needing medical treatment, driving them from the border into Israel to get treatment. She was butchered, mutilated, her corpse so destroyed, they thought she had been kidnapped. They didn't recognize this 70-year-old's body. They couldn't make a positive ID for almost 5 weeks. Literally, the depravity here is beyond words. So I say to you, we need to recognize our common humanity, and we can do that after we defeat the evil of Hamas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Hearn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many Jewish families and organizations in my district that are integral to our community. My district also has a large evangelical population that prays for the peace of Jerusalem, and I'm proud to be one of them. In Tulsa, we have the Sherwin Miller Museum, which hosts a sobering exhibit educating citizens on the realities of the Holocaust. Understanding and remembering history is important if we wish to avoid repeating the horrors of the past. Anti-Semitic demonstrations are taking place on college campuses across the country, and anti-Semitism is up nearly 400% in the United States since the Israel-Hamas war began. It's deeply troubling to see the lack of moral clarity in university leaders who fail or refuse to condemn anti-Semitic demonstration on campuses. It's a sad day in America when parents at school board meetings are deemed terrorists, but Hamas's brutal violence against women and children is defended, even celebrated. Unfortunately, this confusion and chaos in institutions of higher ed is not an anomaly. For decades, we've seen prestigious college campuses slowly soil their reputations by embracing Marxism, Confucius Institutes, and moral relativism as the expense of merit, virtue, and truth. Education is no longer the mission of these universities. Whether intentionally or out of naive stupidity, universities have allowed radical ideologies, often funded by the Chinese Communist Party, to indoctrinate our students. All is not lost, though. In the face of blatant hatred and anti-Semitism, I've been encouraged by the support millions of Americans of all races and religions have shown to our Jewish friends and neighbors. Last week, there was a community meeting in Tulsa to stand up against anti-Semitic hate at a local Jewish synagogue. We need more of these kinds of meetings across America. Supporting Hamas is supporting terrorism, plain and simple. We should not provide tax exemption status to organizations that funnel money to terrorists or take money from known terrorist states. The American people should know if their money is going to support terrorism, and they should be appalled even if 1 American cent is contributed to the causes of terrorism. As a member of the Ways and Means Committee, we hold the power of the purse and tax-exempt status. With that power comes great responsibility to provide oversight on charities and universities that potentially abuse the tax-exempt status. American universities continue to receive billions of dollars in the form of taxpayer subsidies to tax breaks and federal payments, yet anti-Semitic incidents rise on their campuses. Higher ed should not continue to receive taxpayer money in the form of federal payments, grants, or tax exemptions if they continue to turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism on their campuses. The role of the media has played in the recent rise in anti-Semitism should be noted. We have seen various news outlets downplay violent confrontations and threats to harm Jewish people, place blame on Israel despite being the victims of Hamas's attacks, and even try and justify the anti-Semitic acts of some. For example, CBS titled an article, "Jewish Man, 69, Dies After a Clash During Dueling Protests Over Israel-Palestinian Conflict in LA Area." And by doing so, downplayed the fact that the elderly man was violently struck in the head by a pro-Palestinian supporter with a megaphone. Ms. Tishby, I missed part of the hearing here for another meeting, but what do you think of all this? I mean, you obviously are an activist in this area. What's your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm glad you asked me about the role of media. So one of the biggest tropes about the Jewish community is that the Jews control the media. It's an anti-Semitic trope that's very old, and clearly it's not the case, because if the Jews would have controlled the media, we wouldn't have been in the situation in which media outlets around the world refuse to call terrorists terrorists, they call them militants. They refuse to even wait a second before they get a press release from the Gaza Ministry of Health and immediately blame Israel for shooting a rocket at a hospital and killing 500 people. If you would think for a second, it takes more than a minute to count 500 bodies, right? Nobody thinks about that. And we shouldn't really be surprised, sadly. So there's obviously anti-Israel media bias that is extraordinary. I look at the other side on their planning and organization, and I think of what they blame us. They blame us for having a cabal. They seem to be having a great cabal of their own, and the media is a huge part of it. But this is all starting from somewhere. When you train and educate generations of young Americans on college campuses to believe these blood libels, to believe this slander, these lies about Israel and about Zionism and about the Jewish people, then they go on to work at newsrooms and they take Hamas press release at face value. We shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. We need to nip it in the bud. And nipping it in the bud meaning removing it from our children. Removing it from our children entirely. Thank you. I want to take this opportunity for a second and bring into this room the 241 Israeli and other citizens, hostages, Romy, Gal, Tal, Emily, ranges from 9 months to 85 years old, that are held for over a month and a half in captivity with a terrorist organization and unprecedented incidents in the history of the world. So I just wanted to bring them into the halls of this great chamber. And thank you very much for having us all. Thank you.
Thanks for your response. Thank you. I yield back.
Mrs. Miller is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am still utterly horrified by the atrocities committed against our ally, Israel, by Hamas on October 7th. There really are no words to describe what occurred. This depravity is being met fiercely, thank goodness, and I pray that the terrorist organization Hamas is destroyed so that they can never commit these kinds of attacks ever again. It is written in Genesis, the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." I want to specifically thank Talia for joining us today and sharing her harrowing account of terror that was perpetrated by another student against the Jewish community at Cornell University. I can assure you, Talia, that they will be and should be brought to justice. A concerning trend that we have witnessed is the influence of foreign governments on tax-exempt college campuses. One such example is Qatari funding for Northwestern University. It is no coincidence that it now has a campus in the Gulf country and has become a pipeline for reporters for the Qatari state-owned media Al Jazeera and their youth-focused subsidiary AJ+. It is widely reported that Northwestern's president said that the university will not be making an institutional statement on the attacks of Israel. Ironically, Northwestern is a frequent commenter on global events such as the invasion of Ukraine and numerous Supreme Court cases. This has led me to wonder if Qatar's funding for Northwestern plays a role in their non-statement on this geopolitical event. It is hard to miss that Qatar is actively housing Hamas leadership in luxury hotels while Palestinians suffer, or that AJ Plus has been at the forefront of spreading pro-Hamas propaganda on social media sites, especially on TikTok, misinforming our students across the country and inspiring additional anti-Semitism. The Department of Justice has determined that AJ Plus must register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, known as FARA, but they have failed to do so. The fact that they are influencing the thoughts of America's youth without disclosing their funding should be further investigated, and taxpayers should definitely not be subsidizing the universities that allow hatred to spread. Mr. Lehman, while I've highlighted Northwestern's response in particular today, they're not the only Northwesterns and other schools' responses to Hamas attacks. Do you believe that their neutrality and inaction are a result of their financial ties to countries known to support terrorist organizations like Hamas?
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. I would say the following. While at Hillel, we can't know for sure how funding is or isn't impacting the administration, here's what we can say for sure. It was very disappointing to see Northwestern University not speak out, and that was joined by so many other universities who also chose not to speak out. As President Ben Sass at University of Florida shared, this is not hard. So they missed that opportunity horribly. Beyond that, Northwestern actually is a textbook example of where Students for Justice in Palestine has continued to poison the campus climate for Jewish students, including just in recent weeks, publishing fake newspapers demonizing Israel and again alienating Jewish students. Our Hill student leaders are working so hard, and our terrific executive director, Michael Simon there, to actually promote understanding. We've heard from many members, we need to build bridges. These are students, Jewish students, who care deeply about Israel, but care about the harms directed at Palestinian civilians. They want to see justice, dignity, and safety for all, but they cannot find opportunities to build bridges when other groups, literally, and you all should understand this, there are student groups on campus who have anti-normalization policies. They won't even sit down and talk to Jewish students at Northwestern and other campuses. So whatever you all are able to do to, number one, influence the universities in your districts would be terrific. Come visit us at our Hillels. You can talk to students and you will actually be able to lift their spirits. And relative to the authority that you do have, as some members have said, please continue to support the nonprofit security grants. Please continue to drive accountability through Title VI or any other measures that you can. And please just continue to use your voices to speak out. We really appreciate it.
And very briefly, Ms. Tishby, since you're a member of the media, what role should media personalities really play? And what is their real role? Are they supposed to report accurate information?
Can you elaborate on which personalities exactly? Media personalities, social media personality, all of them.
All of them.
I'll tell you what I can say.
Witness can finish, but the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Oh, okay. So I'll do it quickly. Israel was a not cool cause to align yourself with. For many, many years, I was living and working in Hollywood, and as a producer, as an actress, as a writer, and I have tried to get people to vocally support Israel. And they would say, oh, I love Israel, but would you say it publicly? Would you tweet about it? No. So what I encourage people to do, people that have any kind of profile, is to acknowledge the difference between good and evil. Supporting the existence, the safety, and security of the state of Israel does not mean that you always agree with Israeli government's policies. That's fine. But Israel is the only country in the world that her existence is being questioned. That is something that we should not agree to hear anymore. But yeah, I would like to hear from more personalities out there publicly. Thank you.
Ms. Sanchez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity for this committee to acknowledge and confront the reality of rising anti-Semitism and hate, especially on college campuses. And I want to thank each of our witnesses for sharing their stories and their perspectives today, because it takes a lot of courage to speak up. In the wake of Hamas's vicious terrorist attack against Israel on October 7th, our communities are reporting a troubling uptick in reports of anti-Semitic harassment. And I think we are all united in the belief that anti-Semitism cannot be tolerated in any form. It has no place in our communities, especially on college campuses and in our nation's schools. Unaddressed, that kind of hatred threatens the very fabric of our nation. I want to start my questioning with Mr. Greenblatt. I want to thank you for your testimony outlining the significant spike in anti-Semitic incidences in the wake of the Hamas-Israel war. We have to confront hate early and aggressively, and the federal government urgently needs to support programs that combat anti-Semitism. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely agree, Ms. Congresswoman.
And you provided many policy recommendations, which include investing in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which investigates complaints that students have been subjected to ethnic or ancestral slurs or to harassment based on their appearance, dress, or the way they speak in ways that are tied to ethnicity or ancestry. Is that correct?
I mean, Title VI covers protecting students based on ethnicity or national origin. So you have to show a pattern of discrimination, and the university not creating, again, a space where the student is able to learn and live freely.
But the question being, you recommend investing in the Department of Education's
Yes, I do.
Office for Civil Rights. The Office of Civil Rights is responsible for, as you said, ensuring that schools provide all students including students who are or are perceived to be Jewish, Israeli, Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian, in a learning environment that is free from discrimination that's based on race, color, or national origin. Mr. Greenblatt, would slashing the funding for the Office of Civil Rights by 25%, as House Republicans have proposed, make it harder for school and university leaders to protect students and foster a safe and supportive learning environment?
Well, I appreciate the question. I'm not familiar with the particular proposal you're suggesting. I would say that, as I mentioned before, and as I'll reinforce, the Office of Civil Rights, which is there for all students, deserves adequate funding so that it can deal with the large number of cases that it has. And I also believe that the office, you know, there may be things that we can do right now to help it. So, for example, I had a meeting with the Attorney General last week. I recommended detailing lawyers from the Department of Justice over to education. Wouldn't require any additional money, could help them deal with the backlog of cases. I recommended IPAs. You know, you could put people in the federal government on short terms of service. Doesn't require any additional money, but you could do that without raising the head count. And finally, the Department of Education doesn't need to wait for cases to be brought to it. It could appoint almost like a special prosecutor, that's not the right term, but someone to go out there and aggressively look at these cases. Doesn't require any additional money.
I appreciate those recommendations, but my question was whether a 25% cut in the Office of Civil Rights would help or hinder the ability to investigate those kinds of incidences of harassment.
Clearly adequate funding, so I would not recommend funding cuts at this time.
Great. I also just want to point out that House Republicans have also proposed slashing the FBI's operating budget, eliminating hate crime grants, and eliminating the Community Relations Service, which is also known as America's Peacemaker, for helping communities address conflict based on actual or perceived race, color, national origin, or religion. And I only raise those issues because given what the witnesses have shared with us today, I think that we ought not to be talking about slashing funding for vital programs which can help root out these incidences of violence or even prevent them before they escalate to incidents of violence. So instead of the proposed cuts to those critical programs, we should fully fund them or even plus up funding where needed. Lastly, I just wanted to say, Ms. Dror, I really appreciate you being here today and sharing difficult and frightening experiences with us, from threats and harassment to disturbing graffiti that you have experienced on your college campus. And it's not hard to understand why students are scared. What would you suggest my colleagues and I should remember as we consider the different ways the federal government can help address hate and prevent violent attacks on our friends, our families, and our neighbors?
Thank you so much. In terms of legal policy, I'm not an expert yet, so I would defer to the experts on this panel. But I hope you remember that I'm supposed to be in school right now. Like in this exact moment, I'm supposed to be in my constitutional politics class, which is funny.
You might get extra credit for actually being here. I don't know.
Let's hope. But Jewish students deserve to be able to go to their classes.
I agree, and thank you so much for your testimony. I yield back.
Dr. Murphy is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today. I know there's been some really heart-wrenching stories, and I'm sorry you're having to tell them. But that's sadly enough the world that we live in. I've worked since my tenure in Congress a lot on free speech. I've had free speech roundtables. Now this will be the 3rd year in a row next month. And it's just interesting now on campus how free speech is now flipped on its head. Because it used to be if it was diversity in all things except opinion, and that's what's popped the top off it now, because it is not diversity of opinion. And how the anti-Semitism has just exploded in the country is beyond me. It's beyond me. It was never an issue when I was in college, never. And the horrific, murderous, barbaric attacks that occurred, and any college professor should be removed from their position immediately. Any college president should be removed from his or her position immediately. Any student should be expelled immediately. These are no different than inciting neo-Nazi, white supremacy, or anything else.
So we have on one side of the stream where we are attacking the white supremacy neo-Nazis, but all of a sudden there's deference, and they're calling that free speech. That's not free speech. That's inciting violence and death on college campuses today. There is a marked difference. Ms. Dror, you gave a very compelling introductory talk, and I appreciate that a little bit. Let me ask you this. In your experience, do you feel that colleges and universities now have a double standard in regards to free speech?
I believe it's within my free speech rights to put up a mezuzah on my door. That mezuzah has recently been had to...
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating that?
There's a Jewish scroll that Jewish people put on their doorposts.
Right.
I have one on my home. It's within my free speech rights to put one of those on my door.
Right.
That's had to be removed for my safety. How can colleges say that endorsing terrorism is free speech
No,
when
they're
it
not.
directly hinders my ability to express my religious free speech?
Yeah, I have a cross in my office, and you don't know how many times, at least in this institution, they've attacked the cross. That's the cross on which this nation was built. In God we trust. Christian, Judeo-Christian was a foundation on which this nation is built. May not like it, but that's what happened. Ms. Tishby, wow. You've talked about this several times today. I really would love to understand. I've been to Israel twice. When you go into the term from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What does that mean when somebody's Jewish? What happens when they hear those words?
Thank you so much, and I love that you have visual aids. First of all,
They just magically...
I love it. This is fabulous. Let's just acknowledge that the size of Israel is the size of the state of New Jersey. So there are 21 Arab countries in the region, one Jewish state, and for some reason Israel is the big bad wolf. You can barely find it on the map. It's a tiny piece of land. The Jordan River over there to the east and the Mediterranean Sea. When people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they mean that piece of land completely clean. So ethnically cleansing the Jews from their ancestral land. Now, why is that anti-Semitic?
About 30 seconds, I'm trying to say.
I'm sorry?
We're going to have about 30 seconds. So
Why is this anti-Semitic? It's anti-Semitic because if you don't allow only the Jewish people to have a state, if you're anti-Zionist, you're saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just an anti-Zionist. Well, then which other country would you like to dismantle? Usually the answer to that is none, just Israel.
Right.
So people that are obsessing over Israel are anti-Semitic, and that means cleansing that particular piece of land, which is the Jewish people's ancestral land.
It would be very similar, but not nearly as commentary as to say get everything from the Atlantic to Pacific, south of Canada, north of Mexico.
Yeah, America will be free.
Well, thank you. I will say this when we talk about funding. I don't mean this to be partisan, but my Democratic colleagues love to just say more and more funding. How about we cut the funding of these colleges and universities and divert the funding that they already have, I've been on a college board and see an explosion every year, program after program after program. How about we cut and reuse the money? Because otherwise, it becomes a nuclear arms race. Who can scream for more money year after year? So go to these college professors, board of trustees, and to all these folks and say, you're losing your money, which I think the vast majority should anyway, if you don't move your funds from one thing to another. Actually put your money where your mouth is when you talk about true diversity and inclusivity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Kustoff is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses, all of you for appearing today. We've all learned a lot. If I could, Dr. Schanzer, with you, if I could get you for a moment to put on your former Department of Treasury hat. Yesterday, my colleague and I, Congressman Brad Schneider at the other end, introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation, bill number HR 6408. It would authorize the Department of Treasury to revoke the tax-exempt status of any nonprofit deemed to be providing material support or resources to a terrorist group or to a terrorist group like Hamas or any other terrorist group. You were back in your role at Treasury. Can you talk about the benefit that that legislation could provide if it in fact were enacted by Congress?
Certainly, Congressman, and thank you for the question. I did see H.R. 6408, and I think it is a worthwhile initiative. I think that there was a time, though, where Treasury used to track domestic groups and actually sanction them. It has stopped doing that. So we don't do that anymore. We only target external groups, foreign terrorist organizations, foreign charities, foreign individuals. That's what the Treasury does now. So this is probably something that the Department of Justice and the FBI would be able to wield. So if Treasury identifies one of those and they're identified pursuant to this proposed law, then it would be probably something that the Department of Justice and FBI would follow up on. But I do see this as a very valuable tool.
A valuable tool to revoke the tax-exempt status of these organizations.
Correct, as a first step. And then I would say after that, you'd want to have a deeper investigation to find out whether there is criminal activity, because that is certainly what is implied in the language of your proposal.
You talked about American Muslims for Palestine. What about the Islamic Relief Worldwide, the IRW? Are you familiar with them?
I am not as familiar. The reason why I've tracked AMP is because I used to track all the other groups that came before it. I could very easily see their lineage. I'm not tracking all these other groups full time.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. Mr. Greenblatt, thank you for appearing today. Does TikTok contribute to anti-Semitism?
There's no question that social media broadly is a super spreader of anti-Semitism and hate. TikTok has been, as well reported, a considerable amount of disinformation being spread on the platform. We've seen the pro-Hamas hashtags enjoy far greater popularity than the pro-Israel content. Some of that, I think, could be attributed to the volume that's there. I mean, it's a massive platform with billions of users. This body, this committee should be looking at social media and looking at what you can do to rein in the hate that's there, for sure.
And there's been talk about the other media organizations, non-social media. I'm talking about traditional. Do you have an opinion? Because people watch television, right?
Right.
Can you talk about the evenness or the unevenness of how events have been covered since October 7th?
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly astonishing. It's like Al Jazeera has captured our networks. I mean, just so we're clear, and Noah alluded to this earlier, you are not a fighter if you go in and decapitate a baby. You're a murderer. You are not a militant if you go in and execute the elderly. You are a killer. And you know, I've had conversations with the leadership of the AP, the New York Times, the Washington Post, let alone the networks, and it is beyond my understanding and comprehension how these organizations can be confused about the moral standing of these murderers. We didn't call the people who took out the Twin Towers fighters. We called them terrorists because that's what they were. And we didn't call the people who butchered babies in Syria fighters because they were terrorists, and that's what they were. And I don't understand why there is any moral confusion about this here and now.
Mr. Greenblatt. Ms. Tishby, very quickly as my time is expiring, you prophetically maybe wrote a column in Variety several weeks before October 7th. I want to read you a quote. Now, I ask you a question. What you wrote, quote, "Anti-Zionism is the new, hip, and socially acceptable thing to do, as we can see on social networks such as TikTok, which exploded into frenzied criticisms of Israel, sometimes even in dance routines during the May 21 Gaza conflict." I think you wrote this again just a few weeks before October 7th. Can you compare that quote a few weeks before October 7th and now?
Well, now it just became a whole lot more extreme and a whole lot more spread out. We just found out that X, formerly known as Twitter, did not remove 98% of reported anti-Semitic hate speech since October 7th. It only gotten worse. I called it in my book, This Hip New Social Justice Cause, because hating Israel became the norm, and that norm needs to be turned around. As Jonathan was saying, social media is a super spreader. We live in a terrifying world in which if Hitler had TikTok, we'd be seeing another reality. This is what we're dealing with right now, and for some, it's very unfortunate that Israel is patient zero when it comes to misinformation and fake news. Just like it was in the days of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. We're seeing this manifest and change, and this is where we're at today. Anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting conspiracy theory, and it had shifted into what we're seeing today, which is anti-Israel and anti-Zionism.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses here today for sharing your personal experiences and your professional insight. We are 5 weeks removed from Hamas's horrific terrorist attacks resulting in the deaths of thousands, killers, leaving Israeli and Palestinians caught in the crosshairs of war. The aftermath of this conflict is not contained within the active war zone. The effects of the conflict have been made their way to the United States in both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic acts. And to be clear, we must be very clear. We cannot allow anti-Semitism or Islamophobic or any form of hate to grow anywhere, but especially here in America and especially on our college and university campuses. We are unfortunately witnessing homegrown hatred, and we have in this nation, unfortunately, seen this before. One need look only further than my Alabama congressional district to witness the country's centuries-long history of hatred. It was this hatred that culminated in the spilling of blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, including that blood of our former colleague, the great, late John Lewis. The brave foot soldiers that day were advocating for the fundamental constitutional right of access to the ballot box and freedom of speech. While the battle fought that day may have been or appear to be distant, old battles have indeed become new again, and the modern battleground is not a bridge, but college and university campuses. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was shaped by the countless men and women, many so unknown, from my Alabama's 7th Congressional District who experienced discrimination during the height of the Jim Crow South. Now, we know that colleges and universities have a legal obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide all students, including students who are or are perceived to be Jewish or Israeli, a school environment that's free of discrimination based on race, on color, or national origin. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Greenblatt, if you could talk about what colleges and universities must do to address this anti-Semitism so that they don't lose their federal funding under Title VI.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, Congressman Sewell, so thank you. Congresswoman, I would say, number one, like you said, the universities have a legal obligation to protect all of their students, and their Jewish students are being targeted right now. But I must say, we are not going to wait because so many of these university presidents are cowardly and feckless. So I'm proud to share that Mr. Lehman and I, through Hillel and ADL, along with another group called the Brandeis Center, have launched a legal helpline last week called CALL, the Campus Anti-Semitism Legal Line, to make it easy for students to submit cases. We've already had over 150 cases submitted in 1 week. We've trained over 100 lawyers, in part thanks to the help of a law firm, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. And if we do our job right, we will get up to 1,000 lawyers. So you better believe we are not going to wait for these universities to finally show up. We're going to show them, and we're going to bring the cases to them. And I think, I appreciate the conversation about the Qatari money. We talk about dark money in politics. This is dark charity. And dark charity should have no place in our country. And so we should again stop the flow of dark charity, and we should stop the flow of federal funds if these university presidents don't finally do their jobs.
So can you tell students who may be listening what ADL resources are available to them? I mean, you just said being able to file cases.
Yep.
But can they find on your website, where can people go
So they can
to really
text,
find those resources
yep,
to help them?
they can text call help to 51555 to report incidents. Call help to 51555. Number two, they can go to adl.org. Through our deep partnership with Hillel International, we provide training to students so they understand how to deal with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism when they're confronted with it, Congresswoman. So I think between ADL, you can find our stuff at adl.org, and all the amazing resources of Hillel, there's a lot of stuff that students can use.
We must stop hatred,
Thank you.
period,
Agreed.
in this country.
Here,
Thank
here.
you.
The chair would like to remind members and also the witnesses that to keep your remarks within the 5-minute time period. That way, all of the members will have time to ask questions. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I represent the Philadelphia region, Bucks County, Montgomery County, and southeastern Pennsylvania. I was personally horrified in our own example in our backyard to see violent extremist activity, specifically at the University of Pennsylvania. A student proclaimed during a protest in Philadelphia that October 7th attacks by Hamas made her feel empowered and happy, and she later stole an Israeli flag for all the world to see. For someone to feel empowered and happy as innocent children are kidnapped and murdered in cold blood is the most unimaginable thing anyone could imagine in a free society. Dr. Schanzer, thank you for being here, sir. You've been observing an uptick in violence on college campuses linked to Hamas propaganda for quite some time now. Beyond this example, can you provide this committee, for the record, because we want to get a lot of this on the record today, other examples that you've witnessed of violent rhetoric being spread to students since the war began, and how Hamas propaganda has been funneled down to groups on campuses throughout America?
Thank you, Congressman Fitzpatrick, and thank you for representing my hometown of Philadelphia. Go Birds. Look, Penn is probably the worst campus that I've seen during all of this, and this takes nothing away from what we've seen in Cornell. I'll go through just a couple of the examples of what we've seen, the kinds of rhetoric and the threats that have been taking place on this campus. It is embarrassing to me as a son of Philadelphia and as a Jew to see this happening. It is unbelievable that it's happening in America, for that matter. So you have a speaker at Penn against the occupation, a rally praising Hamas for a job well done on 10/7. We have at Penn's A.E. Pie House, someone scribbled the message, "Jews are Nazis." The Hillel was broken into, the Chabad was vandalized, a swastika was drawn on an academic building. We're watching protests where they're calling for Palestine from the river to the sea. This is calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. They're calling for an intifada, a violent uprising. There's a vigil and a walkout to honor the Palestinian martyrs, those that are killed fighting against Israel. And then finally, a faculty senate statement published that was really, I think, the end message was that the university should not cave to Jewish donors who are demanding change. This is unbelievable that it's taking place at Penn. It's unbelievable that it's taking place in America, and it's just a microcosm of what we're watching across the country.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Dror, moving to social media. Obviously, there's been a rise in anti-Semitic language on social media platforms, TikTok probably being the biggest offender, although not the only one by any stretch, which has been used as a tool for Hamas, a wholly owned subsidiary of the CCP, by the way. If you could talk to me what you've seen at your university, where are these young people? It's not just dance videos, right? They're now getting their news from TikTok and some of these other social platforms, which is wholly controlled by a chief adversary of the United States and Israel. So talk to me about the social media impact here, that specifically the impact it's having on college campuses.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually really funny because I deleted my TikTok 3 days ago. I was always a huge user of it, and there was a point where I deleted it and then re-downloaded it, and it changed my whole algorithm. Like, it refines an algorithm for you based on the type of videos you enjoy watching. And so the ones that I didn't enjoy watching, I would filter out. And I got funny TikToks for a while, and then I deleted it, re-downloaded it, and every single video was essentially glorifying the brutal massacre of October 7th. Unfortunately, you're right. This is the news source that students turn to. This is what college students are looking at in between their classes when they're bored. And they're seeing glorification of terrorism all over their social media. And then we're seeing their professors glorify terrorism and reinforce those ideas. And so unfortunately, social media is absolutely contributing to the need for a recalibration of the moral compasses of students and professors everywhere.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear that in my role on the House Intelligence Committee that we will be subpoenaing the algorithm of TikTok to get answers to a lot of these questions. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Chu is recognized.
First, I want to say thank you to our witnesses for being here today and bravely sharing your experiences. No one should be targeted or made to feel unsafe because of who they are. There's no room for hate and anti-Semitism in this country or anywhere. I just met with the hostage families 2 hours ago, and I heard from the family of Abigail Edan, only 3 years old, when the Hamas attacked. Her father fell on top of her to protect her, but was murdered, and then she was kidnapped. These horrific stories are just unbelievable. And then there's what's happening in my state of California, which is reflective of what's happening in the United States. At UCLA earlier this month, students were recorded chanting horrific anti-Semitic language through a megaphone. We heard reports about Jewish students at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and San Jose State being physically attacked, and Jewish students at UC San Diego who needed a police escort to safely leave a student meeting. These and other horrific incidents on college campuses across the country have impacted the climate of schools and are threatening Jewish students' safety on their own campuses. In fact, just the other day in my own district, the Hillel at the Claremont Colleges sent an email to its members with recommendations on how to be safe on campus, including suggesting in some cases it may be safest for students to stay inside and skip classes. I thank Hillel for working to keep students safe, but no person anywhere should be forced to stay home out of fear of being attacked because of who they are. We cannot tolerate these anti-Semitic incidents and Islamophobic incidents, also, as like the unconscionable murder of the 6-year-old Palestinian American boy last month, or any instance of race-based hatred and discrimination. And I can relate to this because for the last 3 years, there have been anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents, and they included slander, insults, assaults, and killings. And there were 11,500 of them because of Asians being blamed for COVID-19. So the first person I must thank is Jonathan Greenblatt and ADL, because as these were starting to happen, you actually were the first organization to speak up and offer your support amid a rise in anti-Asian hate and bigotry during the pandemic. And it meant so much to our communities and helped us make real progress toward protecting vulnerable communities across the United States from hate crimes. And that's what led us to work hard to pass the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which included my bill, the No Hate Act, and to have a major piece of hate crime legislation, the first major piece in 30 years, to improve the ability for victims to be able to report and for law enforcement to be able to also more actively prosecute and also report these hate crimes. Now, as a result of this law, well, for one thing, it created a new program to support state-based hotlines for victims to report crimes. But so far, only 2 states, California and Illinois, have established these systems. And then it actually also provided money to train every law enforcement agency in this country to report hate crimes through the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS. But we still have a ways to go. There are 87 jurisdictions that still have not implemented this system. And without full participation in these new programs, we will not have a full understanding of hate crimes across this country, and our response to incidents like this anti-Semitism that's happening on campuses will be incomplete. So, Mr. Greenblatt, as I discussed, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act and the No Hate Act was born out of an alarming rise in anti-Asian hate crimes during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it will help us better address all hate crimes, including anti-Semitic incidents. Can you talk about why it's important for all state and local jurisdictions to fully participate in these programs by reporting crimes to the NIBRS database and setting up these hate crime reporting hotlines in order to allow the federal government to have a comprehensive response to rising anti-Semitism and all forms of hate?
Yep. So, Congresswoman, thank you for the question. Thank you for your leadership on the No Hate Act. ADL was proud to work with you and with all members of the Asian American, the API caucus on that important piece of legislation. Look, data drives policy. And the fact of the matter is 85 some odd percent of municipalities do not report any hate crimes or affirmatively report 0 every year. And bad data in means bad policy out. So this needs to change. So yes, I mean, I think Director Wray was testifying on the Hill today, pushing the FBI and pushing law enforcement agencies to make sure the reporting hate crimes helps all of us. And so more of it needs to happen so we have an accurate picture of the situation on the ground and therefore can build the right policies and programs in response to that.
Thank you.
Ms. Tinney is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say thanks to the witnesses. Every one of you has been phenomenal in various ways. I got about pages of questions I'd like to ask, but I'd like to first state a few things and just to talk about the shameful state of anti-Semitism that's flourished in our nation's universities, including in my own backyard. After the horrific attacks on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, we have witnessed numerous universities, including some in my own state of New York, thank you to Ms. Dror for being here, that have allowed hate-filled anti-Semitic demonstrations in support of terrorist groups like Hamas to circulate across the campus. Demonstrators outside of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University chanted, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," an anti-Semitic rallying cry long used by terrorist groups to call for the violent destruction of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, as Ms. Tishby so accurately described today from a personal viewpoint. The same was witnessed at the University of Rochester, which I surround with my sprawling district in upstate New York, with the group known as Students for Justice in Palestine, which we've discussed a lot today, hosting increasingly vitriolic and menacing demonstrations. The university has done little or nothing to condemn these hate-filled actions, and students, especially Jewish students, are rightfully fearing for their own safety. In the wake of the Hamas attack, and I want to reference Ms. Dror here, and thank you so much for your courage to be out and be standing up early in this incident. And I don't think that we can state this enough. A professor at Cornell University, Russell Rickford, we should say his name, referred to the slaughter of Israeli civilians by Hamas as energizing and exhilarating. You've heard that from a number of members of Congress today, while speaking at a pro-Palestine protest on Cornell's campus. After these disgraceful comments, I wrote a letter to the Cornell University president demanding Professor Rickford's immediate resignation or removal, but to my knowledge, he has only been placed on leave from the university, but I consider that step one. And I am so grateful for your continued advocacy, Ms. Dror, and your willingness to proudly talk about your own religious beliefs, and something that is, I think we need to talk about this, and I think everybody sort of touched on it, Mr. Greenblatt as well. I was part of a university board. I went to Colgate University. My dad is a graduate of Cornell Law School. My brother went to Syracuse. We've all been educated in upstate New York, which has a wonderful tradition of secondary schools. But I remember something called the Chicago Principles about First Amendment principles, and many colleges and universities would not adopt them. It was a protocol for free speech, but there were certain exemptions in that, and some of those were incitement, defamation, threats, and others to students. But this would give students freedom to express their religious and other views, but also the protection that the First Amendment actually affords all of us to be able to speak freely, and why we revere this country. But I'm concerned that, and I know that everybody's put out all these wonderful, I know that Ms. Tishby put out 3 things that we could do: kick these hate groups off campus, evidence linking state police, FBI, how can they enjoy the warm welcome of Congress? Excellent question. We ask that ourselves every day. And also, Mr. Greenblatt, you laid out 4 things. And one of the things, number 1, was to pass legislation to implement a national strategy. Well, some of our colleagues have actually done that today. But how can we get something like the Chicago Principles and Protocol in place at universities so that we do respect free speech? It's very important. I'm the mother of a Marine. There was the Westboro Baptist Church used to go and celebrate the death of our honorably serving service members. That's hate speech in a way, but it's also First Amendment protected. How do we do this in such a way that we don't incite violence, that we protect our students? What are the strategies? And I'd love to ask, if I can, kind of running out of time, if you can answer quickly, what's your first, how do we do this in like maybe a sentence or 2?
Who's the question directed to?
First, Mr. Greenblatt, because you suggested let's pass a national strategy. Would the Chicago Principles help?
They would. I mean, again, free speech, I think hate speech is the price of free speech. Things we detest, we have to be willing to hear. But there is something profoundly wrong with creating spaces in which the students have to shelter in their dorms for being fear of harassment. This isn't some game like Wordle or something like that. This is real life, and there are real consequences. Chicago Principles, forcing all schools to adopt them, would help enormously.
Thank you. I'd just say, Mr. Lehman, could you just, I know you've been working on this issue, could you give, what's your strategy for this? How can we do something?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll first point out that at Syracuse, we actually had the demonization of Jewish organizations like Hillel, like the Greek organizations, claiming that they are genocidal. This is where we are, and part of the reason we're in such a rut. In terms of quickly pointing out strategy, we have a campus climate initiative. This, again, doesn't need to be that hard. If universities would hard code into their own policies that brighter line around how we protect free speech, we need it, we want it on campus, but be super clear, number 1, around where that line is being breached in terms of incitement, in terms of harassment. And Title VI already gets us a good part of the way there. Is there this pervasive hostile and discriminatory environment? So let's, fund to make sure we can enforce Title VI. Let's create the bright lines. And then I think if we have that basis, let's discipline, because that's the other thing we don't see, which is university leaders actually enforce the rules that are already in place.
Thank you, I respect that. I just think the need to balance, that we feel we need to balance virulent anti-Semitism with the counter of Islamophobia. What happened on these college campuses is not Islamophobia. This is direct, virulent anti-Semitism, and as you say, full stop, Mr. Schanzer. I just want to say thank you all. You have been terrific and insightful, and I hope that everyone out there is watching in the listening audience of Congress.
Thank you for that last point. It's very important. Anti-Semitism is a problem, full stop.
Answer that quickly and we'll move on. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. It has, we've been here a little while, and you have been more than gracious to answer questions, and so I am not going to take too much time, but I will tell you we're committed to helping. As a college student, there is nothing, you should not be having to deal with and face this on college campuses. Parents send their kids to college thinking they're going to be safe, and so I just, my heart goes out to you and to your family. And I think the most striking thing that you said was when you talked about my family's life savings is going to that college. And so please understand we will do what we can to help. And so that was, and Ms. Tenney kind of touched on it. And so I kind of wanted to just maybe open it up, and I know that Ms. Greenblatt wanted to, but what is one thing, maybe, since we're late and I don't want to keep you any longer than you have to, but the one thing that we can do, and Mr. Lehman, you mentioned some, but Mr. Greenblatt, you wanted to add to that, I thought, when you were cut off.
Well, look, I think anti-Semitism needs to be called out full stop. Just like we call out racism and don't say, and you also need to tackle such and such. Yes, there are lots of problems, but we are here to talk about anti-Semitism, and let's stay focused on the problem. So what's one thing to do? Stop the flow of dark charity, like Dr. Schanzer talked about.
And Ms. Tishby.
There's another thing that all college campuses should do, and that is adopt IRA.
Here, here.
We have an
Here,
International Holocaust Alliance, Remembrance Alliance. We have the working definition of what anti-Semitism is, because a lot of people don't actually know what it means. They don't know what anti-Semitism is. They don't understand that it's not just racism. It's not just looking down at someone. It's also conspiratorially looking up at someone. So if you say the Jews control the money, the Jews control the power, the Jews control the media, that's anti-Semitic, and that's not a compliment. When the Jewish community hears that, we get freaked out, because we know what's coming right after that. We've heard this for generations. Adopt IRA. Every college should adopt IRA. We're going to have a much easier time identifying anti-Semitism and fighting against it.
Well, thank you very much. And anybody else have anything they want to add? I know you're tired. You get. I know.
We can do this for hours.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the energy, Mr. Lehman.
Yeah, if I might, I mean, again, we'll go back to Title VI enforcement, because I have spoken to enough university leaders to know that, you know, accountability matters, and a lot of people have spoken about taking away federal funds. That is the consequence of Title VI violations, so I would go back to that. And I would also say something that we've got to get to on the other side of this, which is education, promoting dialogue across difference. It's not something Congress can enforce, but what you can do is deal with taking the hate away from these focused, funded groups that are poisoning campus. Once we remove that, we actually create the space for students to start learning from one another, understanding one another, and that is what we need ultimately to get to where we have the healthy environment we're all looking for.
And Doctor, you had something to add?
Yeah, look, what I would say here is we need to focus on the organizations that embrace the ideology of Hamas. Hamas is a litmus test. If you are an American that are if you're embracing the ideology of Hamas, the actions of Hamas, if you're lionizing the leaders of Hamas, you are anti-Semitic. This is an organization that is dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state and nothing else. And we see far too many organizations out there talking about Hamas as freedom fighters or how they're some kind of legitimate organization operating in Gaza. None of the above. They are a violent terrorist organization that is dedicated to the destruction of the only Jewish state on the map.
If I may, one other quick thing that I don't think has been said enough here, which is Congress has shown enormous leadership, as has this administration, in supporting the legitimate right of Israel to defend itself, in continuing to show a moral compass in terms of condemning Hamas for its atrocious and unbelievable acts of terrorism. And that leadership is important to balance what is unfortunately not being said by too many university leaders, and literally the opposite that they are sometimes hearing in classrooms. So I applaud all of you for what you're doing in that regard.
And I will wrap up by just saying again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being so strong, and God bless, and with that, I yield back.
Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I know you've already been here for hours, but for taking the time to be here with us today, and it's a shame that we actually have to hold a hearing on this topic at all. Condemning anti-Semitism and the acts of evil committed by Hamas, including the slaughter of women, children, and elderly, should be easy. But sadly, we've seen so many hesitant or outright refuse to do so. And worse, we have seen instances where Hamas's disgusting atrocities are cheered. And those who do so should be ashamed. You refer to them as killers. I would refer to them as savages, as barbarians, as butchers, and as animals. We should be able to say that. I'm thankful to have seen most of my colleagues stand together in our support for Israel in the face of these horrific attacks. But since Hamas began its barbaric assault on Israel on October 7th, we have seen nearly a 400% rise in incidents of anti-Semitism across the U.S. compared to last year, and the majority of those have been on college campuses. And Ms. Dror, I applaud you for being here today. As a fellow Cornellian, I graduated at a time, it was the best 4 years of my life. I loved that university. And it was a liberal university at that point, but never did I ever walk on that quad and not feel safe. I'm embarrassed what's going on that campus today. I cannot believe how much it's changed. And I think to myself, why? Why has it changed in those, I'm not even going to say how many years. You're quite a few years younger than I am. But I think what's happened? You know, they have embraced these diversity and equity and inclusion programs. That has been heralded. But what is really going on in these campuses? What is really being taught at these campuses? And why are we having students who come out and are willing to defend these barbarians, these savages, these horrific acts? How is that possible? This is what they're learning. And then you've got professors like our history professor, Russell Rickford, and you recognize this is why. Because this is what they are teaching on our college campuses today. This is exactly what they're teaching us. To hate, to be exhilarated with these savage acts, to defend people who are beheading children. This is what they're teaching our students. And at the same time, they're getting federal taxpayer dollars to do it. Why are we putting up with that? Why are we allowing that? You know, having a 501c organization and therefore you are expected to abide by these ethical standards that are supposed to promote the public good. When I'm looking at what's happening to you, Ms. Dror, and I'm looking at what's happening to students across the country, where they're being harassed, where they're having to lock themselves in to not be harmed by other students, that's not for the public good. When I am seeing professors that are acting like that and not being immediately fired, that is not for the public good. What year are you?
I'm a junior, but I'm graduating this year.
So you're trying to get out of there as fast as you can.
Oh, yeah.
That's a shame. I mean, that is a shame that you were having to do that. Were you not as surprised as I was when they did not immediately fire Professor Russell Rickford?
Unfortunately, I wasn't really surprised. I mean, there are a lot of competing interests. We've spoken about money from Qatar. Cornell gets $1.8 billion from Qatar. We have a medical school there. There are a lot of competing interests, which I'm excited to have heard people express support to investigate. I've been very disappointed, and I really enjoyed my time at Cornell prior to the October 7th attacks and sitting in my classes realizing that my peers want my family dead.
And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but parents, for a university that I revered so much, parents, don't send your kids to colleges, to universities that are going to teach them this hate. Businesses, don't hire students that promote this kind of behavior. And alumni like me, stop sending your money to institutions that hate and are going to teach students to hate America and everything we stand for, and our partners, our advocates, our strongest allies, like Israel.
There's just one thing I want to say to that. I see, like, the school that I attended a Jewish high school. They have, like, lists, I've heard right now, of schools that you shouldn't be attending because they're, like, high anti-Semitism rates, so it's a high-risk school, so you shouldn't go. You're seeing elite schools on that list. You're seeing Cornell, you're seeing Penn, you're seeing Harvard. But what that's getting to is no Jewish students being able to go to elite universities where they get the opportunity to then go into, I mean, why do you go to an elite university? Because you want to get a good job, because you want to make a good connections. Why are Jewish students not afforded that right if their tuition dollars are the same?
And I'm sorry, my time has expired, but thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for all of you. And I yield back.
Ms. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank the witnesses for their patience and indulgence. And I just want to say to you, Ms. Talia, don't let anybody steal your joy, girl. You enjoy your last year at Cornell, your parents' money that paid for that education, and it sounds to me like you are a very intelligent, learned person, and you can teach somebody something and be an example. And I do think that we do have laws. I am going to make inquiries about how Title VI, what the enforcement mechanisms are for that. But I do have a question, and perhaps it's not for you, Talia. Perhaps it's for Dr. Schanzer. These demonstrations, these anti-Semitic demonstrations on campuses, are they largely led by student organizations or spontaneous things, or are they actually things that are supported by the university? I think that's a materially important thing to try to understand.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. They are organized at a grassroots level by some of the groups that I mentioned today in my spoken and written testimony. What is so frustrating is that these chapters, specifically we're talking about Students for Justice in Palestine, many of them actually get student activities fees from the universities.
And that's my point. So it's not like it's sanctioned by the presidents of these universities. So that just leads me to the discussion of your work, Dr. Schanzer, with the Foundations for the Defense of Democracy. You were formerly at the Treasury Department with
yes, ma'am.
With OFAC.
Yeah.
You know, this is very frightening to think that we have to rely on you to identify terrorist organizations as opposed to the Treasury Department. How big is the footprint of OFAC, particularly as some has described about our movement away from the war on terror? How many employees or how many people in the Treasury Department are on this, so that, you know, something innocuous like the Holy Land Foundation or Kind Hearts for Charitable Development, I mean, it doesn't sound mean to me. How far is the reach of Treasury Department into these kinds of organizations to stop them from funding these kinds of activities?
Thank you for this question. It's really important that you ask it, and I'll try to be brief here. In the 2000s, when I worked there, we did tackle some of the domestic groups that were operating here in the United States, like Holy Land, Kind Hearts, et cetera. By the end of that decade, we stopped doing that through the Treasury. It became the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice and the FBI to look at entities that were operating inside this country. It wasn't just good enough to freeze assets, and it was actually even a bit complicated.
Let me stop, because the chairman's going to cut me off. So we had a big funding of IRS agents. This is one of the things that they could be trying to analyze, but you say it's no longer the jurisdiction?
Not in the Terror Finance Department. IRS, I think it could be quite helpful.
If we had, so we, you know, Mr. Chairman, we need the money. You know, I just want to say before my time has run out that I am the product of people protesting and dissenting and exercising their First Amendment rights. The college and university I went to, you know, it was white German kids and white Irish Catholics that protested on Marquette's campus along with the black football players to try to get somebody like me an opportunity to go to college. And they gathered at St. John's church on campus. They had bread and water feasts. You know, their parents were terrified because their kids were hungry, going hungry, and they wouldn't eat anything but bread and water until the university responded to the need to have somebody other than black basketball players. And it was during the Al McGuire days when, you know, black athletes were at a premium at Marquette, and only white kids. And so I just want to say, I really think it's important for us to draw a line. And that's why I asked the question that I asked, you know, so that schools are not just summarily punished for free speech. There are uncomfortable conversations, Mr. Greenblatt. If I were to sit here right now and call out some racist stuff that I see that happens every day in Congress, they'd be out there censuring me on the floor. And all I'm asking for is just to tell me today you're gonna censure me so I can have my hair done and the outfit that I wanna wear. Because we have, so I'm not trying to be, funny here. I'm just trying to say that I think it's extremely important that we preserve people's right to petition their government, but at the same time, every student everywhere ought to have the right to learn without being intimidated and without being harmed. And that is the promise of America, that you can learn and earn and do it. Girlfriend, do it and hold your head high. You tell them that Gwen Moore told you to do it. I yield back.
Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and amen, Ms. Moore. Thank you for your comments. I applaud you for those. I agree with you. I just want to also thank our witnesses, and thank you for taking the time to be here. My heart bleeds. It hurts. I was in Israel. I was at a kibbutz that saw the atrocities. And I can't imagine the humanity and how this can occur. But I do know this. I do know that it's America's job to protect and support our dearest allies in Israel. And that includes financial support. It includes stopping all forms of intimidation. And it also is about stopping the flow of money from American organizations to terrorists whose sole purpose is to annihilate Israel. The federal government has several entities responsible for tracking illicit funding, and we need to be assessing and strengthening and building on these and stopping what's occurring. So, Mr. Schanzer, I know you've talked about this in length already, but I want to look for solutions. We can talk about what's all happening. We all get it. We've heard it. But what are the solutions? What can we do to track it down? And do you see any new technologies, anything that we can use, whether it be AI or whatever, that we as Congress can act upon?
Congressman Fenestra, if you're referring to the activities of some of these extremist groups and how we can stop them, look, I think part of it is about perhaps reforming the tax code, not giving 501c3 breaks to organizations that we know are embracing hate speech and targeting specific sectors of American society. That should be beyond the pale. I don't think you need AI for that, right? That's
right.
A fairly
That's simple, absolutely
straightforward.
Correct.
Now, from there, we've got, I think it's a murkier question, right? You've got it when you start seeing organizations that have connections to terrorist groups in the past, terrorist charities in the past, there's got to be follow-up, and that requires the bureaucracy, that requires resources, and I know those resources are tougher and tougher to come by, but I do think we, as I said before, I think we got to figure out how to walk and chew gum. We should be able to do great power competition while also tracking the potential terrorist groups or extremist groups or hate groups that are terrorizing entire sectors of American society.
That's right. I agree with you 100%. And we got to be active. I mean, we all can talk. We talk a great game, but we got to do it. And we can do many of those things. Lehman, I know you talked about this a little bit in your testimony, but
yeah, if I can add one thing, Congressman Finster, as well, which is AI needs to be better deployed in terms of basic security. Yes. We have seen so many issues, obviously, in broader society, but including on campus, where it is not rocket science to trace and see where those threats and issues are originating. And I would love to see, frankly, college students who are bright like Talia deployed, but we have even more resources at a federal government level. Let's take those resources, start understanding where the threats are originating, and that will help organizations like Hillel and all universities do a better job of defending
absolutely.
themselves.
Ms. Dror, I want to get to you, and I just want to say something, that I have 3 children in college, all right, your age, and it pains me to hear what is going on, right? I send my kids to college. I never worry about their safety, nor should I as a dad, right? But you and your parents, that's scary. It's scary stuff. Now, my question for you, and I'll ask Mr. Lehman too, but Mrs. Dror, these these universities, and I know your university has this too, I mean, we promote this idea of DEI, right? Diversity, inclusion, equity, equality. Has this come out at all in your institution of saying, are you protecting yourself and all these great students that are there?
Following the death threats, the university has taken a greater initiative to integrate Jewish students into their DEI efforts. Those have been appreciated. In terms of the anonymous platforms, I did want to say,
yes.
Side chat is very much used at Cornell, so is GreekRank. The threats were made on GreekRank. These are anonymous posting platforms in which students don't have their names attached to what they're saying. I have seen so much horrific stuff. Like, I open up side chat to look at jokes, to look at people making fun of professors, to look at funny things. I am met with the word Zionism used as a curse word every single day in every single post, and students are not being held accountable for it.
Oh, that's so sad.
Posts that are deeply anti-Semitic, posts that have roots to Jews running the money, like these deeply anti-Semitic tropes, have over 300 upvotes. People who are hiding behind their cell phones are upvoting anti-Semitic comments. These anonymous platforms are widely used by students. Maybe they shouldn't be.
No, and I agree. And I was on a university, I was a professor, and I checked these chats too, because obviously they destroy professors. That's nothing. I can handle that, right? But what is happening on those side chats, anonymous, all right? People hiding and saying and destroying other students is completely uncalled for. And our university's got to take note and stop this. I know my university that I was part of, we stopped some of these side chats because it's completely wrong. Thank you, I yield back.
Ms. Malitakis is recognized.
Thank you all for being here. This is an incredibly important discussion that needs to be had. It needs to be exposed, and we must all work together to find solutions. I find it incredibly disturbing, disheartening, heartbreaking to see the anti-Semitism that is occurring right here in this country, in the United States of America, full on display. And you know what? It's college campuses, but it's larger than that. I mean, we're seeing it. Institutions that were respected, right? The United Nations, for example, Congress, colleges and universities. We have to work together to figure out, but we need to have, as you mentioned, a definition, parameters, and solutions. I think that some of the things that we've been seeing for this next generation, certainly on our college campuses, are disturbing. And we've mentioned a few of those horrific threats, assaults, incidents that have happened in universities. University of Maryland may have been one of the worst, referencing Holocaust 2.0. But some happening in my own state of New York, unfortunately too many of it. Cornell University, thank you for coming today and your bravery to speak. You are very impressive, and I imagine we're going to see great things from you in the future. But looking at what happened at Columbia University when an Israeli student was attacked outside the library, hundreds of professors signing a letter supporting Hamas's terror. NYU, Cooper Union, Jewish students had to be locked in a library for their own safety. We can go on, and one of the worst examples that didn't happen after October 7th, but before, was at City University of New York. All right, we had a law school last year thought it was a good idea to have an anti-Semitic graduation speaker who actually said, quote, "I want to celebrate CUNY Law as one of the few, if not the only law school to make a public statement defending the right of its students to organize and speak out against Israeli settler colonization. This is the law school that passed and endorsed BDS on the student and faculty level, recognizing that absent a critical imperialism settler colony lens, our work and this school's mission statement is void of value." I mean, this is what they're saying at graduations at our college university. So the answer, what is the answer? And we talked about some solutions today. I would like to know, I mean, do you think we should be, first of all, we have to define it, right? And then you mentioned the IHRA definition. I've actually just sponsored legislation that would require the Department of Education, require these universities to follow that definition, because we need to have parameters, right? Or else it always is a slippery slope. But I think we need to use that definition and then go after these institutions and strip federal funding from colleges and institutions that allow, that fund, that facilitate events that promote anti-Semitism, or have professors that teach it to our young people. The fact that, they're teaching our young people that Hamas, that they're freedom fighters, that they're not a terrorist organization. That's what they're teaching our young people, and it's disgraceful. What about federal financial aid? Should we be prohibiting that aid from being used at such institutions? Those are American tax dollars. Maybe they should be going to better universities that are not teaching these things to our people, so maybe we want to prohibit that. Maybe we should be rescinding tax-exempt status from these institutions and organizations. And maybe we should be looking to see if these are any foreign students that have a student visa, maybe it should be revoked if they are participating in this anti-Semitism on our college campuses. Would love to hear your responses to those 4 ideas, and we'll start with you, Ms. Dror.
Like I said before, I'm not a legal policy expert, so I'm going to defer to the actual legal policy expert.
Lehman.
Yeah, thank you. As we've been discussing, Title VI enforcement does actually invoke several of those remedies in terms of financial penalty. That has to be a part of the equation. Let's use what we have available. I also want to go back to a prior question about DEI and briefly just point out the world is upside down. We have DEI offices who specifically in the wake of October 7th made a point of celebrating resistance and alienating their Jewish student communities. It's literally backwards. So apart from financial penalties, if there are DEI offices accountable to provide the same protection for Jewish students that they should be affording to every other minority.
I definitely support revoking visa status. As an immigrant to this country and a proud American, I had to go through a rigmarole in order to become a citizen. I think that it should be revoked, and we need to make sure that they're not using our democracy against us. They're using the democracy against us. We can't allow that to happen.
We should do as much as we can. I think everything from adopting IRA to implementing DEI, requiring with anti-Semitism to Title VI remedies. I don't know enough about revoking people's student visas, but again, the full force of the law will make these universities listen.
Thank you.
Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and let me thank the witnesses for your patience, but also your clarity here. I'm going to kind of run through and maybe jump around. Talia, Ms. Dror, thank you. Something maybe you didn't expect to hear from the podium, but kol kavod. You've been wonderful. Is that your parents behind you?
They are, yes.
You should be very proud of your daughter. My sons are a decade ahead of you. My oldest son is a Dartmouth grad and at Harvard Law School. Mr. Lehman, I thought you'd appreciate that. We're from Chicago. My physical therapist is someone named Jennifer Cohn. Her husband Charles works with you. She says hello. I'm gonna have connections with all of you before I'm done here. But I want to thank you. My younger son went to Muhlenberg and school, also with a large Jewish population. They were a decade earlier, so it was a different experience. But he had a classmate named from Chicago named Madison Poland. And her cousin, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, is a captive in Gaza right now. You may have heard his story. He lost his arm. We need to get the Red Cross into seeing those captives. We need to get those captives home today, yesterday, in fact. Ms. Tishby, you touched on the fact 240. The youngest one is, was taken at 9 months, is now
9 months, yeah.
10 months old.
10 months old, and also...
Wait, don't take this is my story. I'm teasing. But he's not the youngest one anymore.
I know.
There was a woman who was 8 months pregnant when she was taken captive, and we believe that she has now given birth. So the youngest captive is someone who is, God willing, alive, and yet has spent every day of that baby's life a captive of Hamas and must be able to come home.
Bring them home.
Bring them home. One of my colleagues mentioned that anti-Semitism wasn't an issue when we were in school. I went to school a long time ago, 40 years ago, at Northwestern, which I'm going to come back to in a second. Anti-Semitism has always been an issue. It just hasn't always been front and center. It hasn't been open. It hasn't been so accepted. And today, not only is it open and accepted, and I take this term from someone I saw screaming about it in the UK, it's fashion. It's fashionable to be anti-Semitic. And the high anti-Semitism now is anti-Zionism, and people are celebrating it. I think Natan Sharansky, who was there yesterday, I had a chance to speak with for a little bit, his 3 Ds of demonization, delegitimization, and double standard hits it right on the head. And Dr. Schanzer, last time we were together, I did a march through history going back to the 3,000 years that the Jews have been in the land of Israel. I'm going to go to the reverse area, and this I will start with Ms. Tishby. Israel was created what year?
1948, reemerged.
And Google is a wonderful thing. Your grandmother was the founder of a kibbutz, Degania. What year was Degania created?
Degania was created in 1910. 1910, yes. I was going to say 8, but...
Right, it was a community that predated the state of Israel and is still there today.
There's been Jewish presence in the land of Israel for generations,
So
forever.
we are on the same wavelength because those can go to Sfat.
Yeah.
And what's Sfat famous for?
Kabbalah.
Kabbalah. The Jews that came to Sfat at that time, where did they come from?
Jerusalem and
Spain.
Spain, yeah.
They came from Spain because they were kicked out of Spain in the 16th century. But Sfat was one of the 4 holy cities at the time of the Bible, 2,000 years ago. Jews have been in the land of Israel for 3,000 years. And I mention that because that is what we're talking about here on campuses. This argument that Israel is a colonial enterprise, a post-colonial, I don't even know the words that they say. It's not. It's
Settler colonialist.
So thank you. That is the
Apartheid
terms.
oppressor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last bastion of settler colonialism that needs to be
Even though it's a place where Jews have lived for so long. So, Mr. Lehman, if I can touch on you in the last year, free speech, as a lawyer, free speech is not always acceptable. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. It's the idea of fighting words. And I looked it up from Cornell's website, in fact, but fighting words are words meant to incite violence such that they may not be protected free speech under the First Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court first defined them in Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942, as words, quote, by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite immediate breach of the peace, end quote. Mr. Lehman, are we seeing that on college campuses, and are there things that universities can do to address it?
Yeah, well, say hello to Jennifer Cohen. I saw her husband, who's a fantastic Hillel director, on Sunday, Charles. But on this issue, we are seeing it, and again, what is so problematic is we're seeing it in hundreds of campuses with hundreds of instances of hate speech. We have documented them, and they are hate speech that exactly crosses the line you're describing because they are inciting violence. The words are around genocide of and by Jews, and the words are directed at Jews in a way that, frankly, never asks them, by the way, what they think about the Middle East. No one ever says, what do you think about the two-state solution? No one ever says, are you empathetic to Palestinians? Do you care about their rights and future as well? All they do is treat Jewish students in these cases as these horrible baby killers, and it has to stop. And that's, again, what we're trying to
I wish I
deal
had more
with.
time to talk more. I will say Northwestern they got it wrong at first. They are creating a anti-Semitism task force finally and taking steps. I think it's what schools can do. Mr. Greenblatt, you have it in your testimony, and I will highlight it as well. Thank you all very much. I yield back.
Mr. Carey is recognized.
I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank also the ranking member for allowing this committee to be put together. And I think if you've seen anything from this body today, in the words of one of the singers he's still a singer, but there was a song that said, "There's no monopoly on common sense on either side of the political fence." And I think you've seen that from all of us today. Over the last month, there have been multiple instances of anti-Semitism and crimes committed against the Jewish community in and around Central Ohio. Talia, I was with some Ohio State students. They said that they had been reaching out with you. I was just with them yesterday. But last month in Bexley, Ohio, which is a community that is probably a mile and a half, I split the city of Columbus in half with my dear friend Joyce Beatty. But on the east side of Columbus, an individual, many of you have seen this video, approached a Jewish woman's house. And after she answered the door, thankfully with a Ring camera, the man spewed anti-Semitism into her Ring doorbell camera. Then, the same individual proceeded to a nearby house, flying the Israeli flag, and did the exact same thing. Now, this is a neighborhood that my wife and I spend an awful lot of time in. Our friends live in this neighborhood. One of our friends, who was with my wife on the night that I met her, is 40 years old, went to her birthday party. And for the first time in her life, and she's Jewish, for the first time in her life, her mother called her and said, "Be careful of your surroundings." Now, this is something that she felt very common with, just being a female and younger, and it was the first time she was ever fearful of religion. Then, just last week, Talia, as these students were telling me, one incident occurred at OSU's Hillel Wexler Jewish Center, and another outside of a bar close to campus. These incidents are just some of the many occurrences that are happening across the country. And as I said yesterday, I had the opportunity, the privilege, to meet with the Ohio Jewish community and a group of students from Ohio State. It was incredible to hear their story. I worked with several members of my delegation from Ohio, and we have just sent a letter to the acting president. And one of the things that I've seen is a lot of these universities, while they've made statements now, waited a little too long to do that. But I will say I applaud what Ohio State has come out and done. We have 3,000 Jewish students at Ohio State, and I do applaud their efforts. One thing that I have found interesting is we have a very big Jewish community in the 15th Congressional District, were the calls that we're getting in our congressional offices. Now, you would think they would be individuals that were just concerned about what is happening in the world today, but I've kind of seen the body politic from a different view for many, many years. These are push calls. These are individuals that are called, and they are given a script and immediately told, press 1 if you want to complain to your congressman. Now, I only have a minute and a half, and I apologize, I went on a little too long, but Dr. Schanzer, who do you think might be paying for these calls that say that my staff is working for the Israeli government?
It's a good question. I obviously don't know.
No, I know.
But we have a pretty good idea of the network that is pushing this deeply anti-Semitic, anti-Israel sentiment on Capitol Hill.
Don't you all find it also increasingly interesting that these phone calls tend to pick up, I don't know, when there happens to be a big protest that's right outside our office, or maybe a day or two after the protest. So the coordination of these entities, as you pointed out, is very clear. We've got to stop the money, and we've got to push back on college campuses that don't stand up for our students. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience today. I will try to be quick, as I am, I think, the last person to ask you a question and make a statement. I was part of the first congressional delegation to go into Israel on the Tuesday after the Saturday attack. We were there in the Middle East to talk about peace, and unfortunately we left talking about war. We were able to go into Israel by driving across the border from Amman, and we were able to speak to the leadership and to a few victims on that Tuesday after that Saturday bloodthirsty attack. Obviously, I felt the trauma, and will always remember the determination that was evoked from this attack, and will continue as we get through this. But yesterday, members of Congress had the opportunity to then view the 45-minute compilation of videos from this attack. And as you can imagine, it absolutely was horrific. And I was telling somebody about this opportunity to do that, and they asked, what were some of the images that stand out with you? What images didn't stand out with me? Hardly any. But a couple that come to mind were obviously the father who was killed in front of his two sons with that grenade, a video of a blood trail throughout a house that just seemed to go on and on and on. It just makes you think, why were they dragging this body throughout the house? But one of the videos that stood out to me was when there were certain videos that were taken in Gaza of hostages, of lifeless bodies that were taken there, and you see the celebration that went on. Not by Hamas fighters, but what seemed to be civilians. The spitting on the hostages, the kicking of lifeless bodies of IDF soldiers that were brought back into Gaza. And it made me think that this is not an issue about land, it's an issue about a belief. And it reminded me of an Economist article that I read that talked about, the headline is, how the term genocide is misused in the Israel-Hamas war. And in it, it says Hamas is a genocidal organization. And that made me think of, Mr. Schanzer, you were on TV with Jake Tapper when he did an excellent job laying out these three kind of principles from Hamas leadership and showing these videos of where one of the Hamas leaders said, sacrifice of people is necessary. Two, they said the people in Gaza basically are not our problem. They're all refugees, therefore it's the responsibility of the UN to protect them, not Hamas. And three, they showed that one of the leaders of Hamas basically say, yes, there will be a second, third, fourth attack because we have the determination and the resolve and the capabilities to fight. We're ready to pay the price. We are a nation of martyrs. And then you went on to sort of tie it up. I don't know if you remember that, but you did an excellent job. And it makes me think then about the slogan from the river to the sea, an idealistic vow of liberation that implies the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, obviously, there are some who are protesting now who are naive to that meeting. But as I read in an article, anyone who is paying attention knows exactly what that means. Now, I do believe that we must uphold the principles of free speech. However, we can't use that as a shield to hate speech that consists of specific threats of violence targeted against a specific group. We know this. Now, Mr. Greenblatt, you have noted that anti-Semitic incidents tend to spike whenever there is a conflict involving Israel, including the current Israel-Gaza war. Is that because nowadays what we're seeing, that real wars and cultural wars are no longer separate struggles?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Congressman. I'll just say, number one, the reason why you butcher and brutalize corpses, there's a straight line from that to tearing down the posters of hostages. It is dehumanizing people. It is demonizing them. It is rendering them as objects, as subhuman. It's what the Nazis did 70 years ago. It's what Hamas would do today. That's why we are so fervent about the evil of anti-Zionism. Again, it flattens people into caricatures and leaves all of us as Jews vulnerable. That's number one. Number two, culture wars, violent wars. I've said loudly for all to hear in the prior administration that using dehumanizing, violent rhetoric leads to inhumane and violent actions. And some on the left applauded me for saying that. Well, it's true here too. And so when members of Congress in the well of the House use language like from the river to the sea, that is like saying Germany is for Germans in 1933. And so yes, culture wars can lead to real world violence, and we shouldn't tolerate it when it's directed at anyone, regardless of the color of their skin, the nature of their faith, or any aspect of their identity.
Thank you. Thanks to all the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank every one of you all for testifying. This was an extremely important hearing, and I'm very thankful that we had it today. And I hope that every one of you have a very happy Thanksgiving. We're looking forward to leaving Washington after 10 weeks. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the committee